Okay, I think we'll dive. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Revolution. This is the the 12th of April, and we've had close to 3 months of the ongoing administration, and I think our understanding of the administration has been evolving, and we're at a place when we can better talk about the ongoing policies and the effects of it. And today we're going to discuss this in relation to the undoing or possibilities of the undoing of the US empire. So I'll hand it over to Doc to begin the discussion.
Thank you, and good morning. And again, this is very difficult, as we all know, to make sense of things that don't seem to have any sense behind them. It seems that the Trump administration is proceeding randomly and improvisationally, and that rather than intended consequences, unintended consequences might dominate. And some of this, Shantanu and Jeremiah will look at a couple of commentators on it, but everybody has something to say these days. And a good part of what is being said is not significant. So you can get lost in this jungle of commentary. For example, this morning, if you look at the headlines of the New York Times, and interestingly, I've retreated to reading headlines because these articles are, most of them written from the position of panic of the ruling elite. And it's like crybabies, oh, look what he's doing to us and how will we survive? And I don't, I don't want to hear all that crybaby shit, But this morning, and I think the New York Times, in the news and the editorial pages are pursuing ideologically and politically the anti-Trump agenda. So it's totally one-sided, and we've heard so much of it before. The other paper that I read is the Financial Times, and their headline today is their headlines are more about the dollar and the monetary and financial systems, and what will become of the dollar, and what will become of the trading system if the dollar is not the central reserve currency. In other words, the currency through which trade is carried out, and that most nations or all nations have reserves of dollars in order to carry out trade. And that's, at least it's not the tone of the New York Times, which the New York Times, by the way, sets the framework for the rest of the news media, MSNBC, CNN, and so on. So it's like an echo chamber. You're listening to the same stuff over and over and over again. Now, there are some podcasts that are a little bit better. One of my favorites, Alexander Mercurius, has just become a drone, and, because his concern is always the Ukraine war and Russia. And when other things happen in the world, you can see a lack of expertise on his part. And that's okay. But sometimes he treats these other events as bothersome. But I've been listening recently Tanima, whose last name I can't pronounce, who is a Brazilian, lives in Brazil but is an Iranian by ancestry. Dialogue works, I think. And he's been having this guy, Alexander Craner. Mhm. And suddenly Alexander Craner is a celebrity in the podcast world, a part of it. And he says interesting things. He is tends to be, and I think people who listen to him, he tends to be a little more sober-minded uh, and uh, giving Trump more benefit of the doubt, although not completely. I just cannot, Larry Johnson and Wilkerson, I can't understand them at all. They tend to say the same thing over and over and over again. And then you have Scott Ritter, who had forced himself into every podcast that would have him over the last maybe year and a half. And he seems to be in something of a meltdown, emotional, intellectual meltdown. That he says, well, I support the Iranian people, but they created this situation of war by not doing what Trump told them to do. Is that the only option? And since Trump in Ritter's worldview is a revolutionary, whatever Trump does is revolutionary. Now, in terms of Scott Ritter and Steve Bannon, they have I think, an infantile idea of what a revolution is. For them, a revolution is destroying. So anybody that destroys the old system or seeks to destroy the old system is, by their definition, a revolutionary. So, but you can see it in Scott Ritter. So the bombing of the Houthis, that's revolutionary because Trump does it. Where I think Alexander Craner is more sober-minded, who also sees not so much Trump, but the situation in Europe as leading to a revolution, a possible revolution. Speaking in some ways like we have been speaking for some time, that Europe is on the cusp of a French Revolution type revolution, where the regimes that currently exist will be replaced. And he sees in Europe, and that's where he is located, that is his focus, something similar to what we see in the United States. But I think that the fact that these political calculations have to be put on the table is important. Now, in an opposite way, last Saturday, there were these demonstrations all over the country. It's estimated that about 600,000 people participated. Matter of fact, I didn't even know they were about to occur. How did people find out about it? I guess you had to be a part of uh, what they call nonprofit or the Democratic Party network. But anyway, surprise, surprise. This was the Democratic Party. This was the actions of those who were defeated in November. Here in Philadelphia, the usual suspects in the forefront of it. And by usual suspects, I'm talking about the cabal of opportunists and so on. Let's keep it 100. Most people that are leading these demonstrations in Philly, we know them and we know they're running for political office. But what was I going to say? Yeah, so this left, and that you always have to put this in quotes these days, inverted commas as they call them. This left is frankly without much support. Certainly, the working class and Black folk in a city like Philadelphia don't turn out tells us something. And that's what these demonstrations were across the country, with from what I could see from the photographs, they were supporting everything from same-sex marriage and trans people to NATO. Now, if that's your coalition, we in deep trouble, you know. So, literally saying, in effect, that war and brinksmanship, nuclear brinksmanship, which was the Biden policy, is acceptable if Social Security and trans identities are not touched. This is the height of opportunism, obviously. But just a small thing on them, because they only have a short game, and that is defeat Trump and bring a government in, something like Biden or Kamala Harris. That's all. Um, and um, and therefore, they're easily dismissed in spite of the fact that they wish to celebrate themselves and such. But the way I've tried to think about these things over the last week or a little bit more is that we have to look at um, different calculuses. For example, short game calculus, medium game calculus, and long game or end game calculus. I know for ourselves, we have always tried to think long game. You know, we really have. And this goes back a couple of years. And in fact, you know, it's so interesting that there are people who see us as disloyal to whatever they are loyal to because we look long game or end game rather than short game. You know, short game, we have to elect Kamala Harris. Long game, we have to end war. You see what I'm saying? Short game is that Trump is a fascist. Long game is, well, what are Trump's intentions and what are unintended consequences of his actions? And it is obvious that, agree or disagree, Trump plays on the large stage. It is not a small stage that he operates on, and that he performs at times, and at other times he's not performing. So, so at one level, to understand where we are and what is happening, we have to look at what his possible end game scenarios are. That doesn't mean we agree with them, but to understand what he is doing you have to see what his long game calculuses are, you know. Um, but we think long game, it's kind of rooted in the DNA of the free school. Um, I mean, it's everything we do. I mean, like Robeson, the Baldwin year, everything is, we're thinking future and a long game. And that's why we were so at odds with a lot of other people celebrating Baldwin, because they wanted to think of him in these narrow, immediate things. I'm trans, so, or I'm queer, and therefore I see Baldwin as queer. Short game. We were looking at Baldwin in totalities. Okay. Now, having said that, um, I think that Trump has made certain moves domestically, internationally, politically, militarily, which are huge and have huge consequences. It would be fatal to see him as not having a longer range view of things. Um, and if that's a game you want to play, join these little marches and talk trash, and frankly, join a nonprofit, and then again, institutionalize trash talking and bullshit. That's what they are. And a few people getting paid. You see what I'm saying? And, by the way, and since they are, inverted commas, good people, we should give them the benefit of the doubt. Well, first of all, I don't accept that they're good people. And I don't believe that they're acting on their own. There is a puppeteer. There is something behind them. Uh, and the final thing, I don't see them as moral people. I see them as amoral as Trump is. If you understand where I'm coming from, it's just a different expression of amorality. Um, but I don't want to get lost. But okay, let's if we assume, and I think we must, that Trump is operating on a large scale to challenge, if not undo, the existing political, military, economic relationships that emerge after World War II. These relationships are the foundation of American power and of the American empire. Let me put it another way. You cannot start in 2016 with Trump's first election and say that, well, I'm going to understand and I will attempt to understand everything since that time through the bad guy, the red guy, Trump. No, I think you have to begin with the post World War II organization of the world, at least of the majority of the world, including most of the formerly colonized nations. The financial architecture is known as the Bretton Woods Agreement, which established the dollar and gold as equivalent. That so much so, if you had dollars, you could always be guaranteed that if you didn't want the dollars, you could trade them in for gold. That they were the two financial pillars of the world system of trade and investment. NATO became the military arm. Now, NATO then and NATO today are different things. But back then, the center of the military standoff was in Europe. It was the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc. The legal framing, legal political framing, was the United Nations and ultimately the Security Council. As relates to the formerly colonized nations, except for China, and China was never fully colonized. There was a different arrangement. It was more semi-colonial, indirect colonial rule. India, Africa, all of Africa, most of South America. All of those countries would be brought into this new arrangement through their dependency upon the currencies of their former colonizers. You see what I'm saying? That their role or part in the global economy would be mediated through, for example, the French colonies of Africa. Their currencies were based upon the franc, and even if they had a currency, a lot of them, even in their domestic economies, relied upon the franc, or I forget what they call it in the French former African colonies. They call it some kind of franc. I forget off the top of my head. The English speaking, like Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and others that were colonized by the British would use the pound more or less. But all of these currencies were underpinned by gold and the dollar. You see what I'm saying? And currencies, you'll hear this markets. And for us, when we say markets, we mean Whole Foods, or we mean, going to the store to buy something. When they talk about markets, they're talking about money markets, stock markets, bond markets, which throws everybody off. You said, I thought you were talking about the price of eggs. I said, no, man. We're talking about how much you pay for on treasury notes, bond markets, or the stock market. It's just crazy, the narrative at that level, and how the realities of ordinary people are not even considered in the language. We're back to Baldwin now. If you don't exist in language, you don't exist. But that's a whole nother parentheses. But at any rate, the system of neocolonialism, which many people call financial colonialism, and the difficulty, once you are bound to that, to break out of it. And in this sense, as I thought about things, I became more empathetic to India. And I became more, how could I say, hero worshiping of Indira. It took that kind of courage to break the hold of the pound and the dollar over the Indian economy. Okay? And everything since her has been a cowardly retreat. And thus, you get to the point where hardly anybody in India, at least that I hear about, has the idea to get out of this paradox they're in. A great nation, a nation that's showing really fast economic growth, which can't seemingly decide for itself where it will fit in and what its alliances will be, at least up to this point. I think things might be, but you see the crisis. Or you take a country like Nigeria, the most populous nation in Africa, a huge nation, a lot of potential, a lot of oil, a lot of other resources, but they remain poor and get poor and more corrupt. I mean, it's embarrassing. Frankly, sometimes I wonder how Nigerians, elite Nigerians, even show up at some places. And then, oh God, maybe I'm like Alice is more critical of Chinese. I'm more critical of black folk. But the woman who heads the WTO, or the World Bank, is Nigerian, or at least she was. Now she's an American citizen. You know, in the last few years. I mean, maybe that's the deal so her kids can go to Harvard. But they're bound by these financial networks that lead back to the City of London and to Wall Street. They're bound by it. And they cannot find a way out. And the elites can only find a consensus around, let's keep doing what we've been doing, because that helps us out. The nation gets poorer, although the elites get wealthier. And that's kind of one of the definitions of neocolonialism. But, okay, I just say all of that to say the world stage. Now, the system coming out of World War II that I just tried to describe has not gone without crises, internal contradictions. The big one was 1971, where, you know, the Nixon administration said, we can no longer back up or back up gold by dollars. In other words, we're going off the gold standard because the debt of the United States is becoming so great because of the price of empire. I want to come back to that. Some people say because of the Vietnam War. Yes, but the Vietnam War was part of the cost of empire, because there was a Vietnam War, but only a decade or more before that went down, you had the Korean War. And then you had this huge military buildup to, quote, contain China and the Soviet Union, the cost of empire, which is far more today than it was back then. And so, therefore, the dollar or the US government could not guarantee that if the central bank of, let us say, Germany came to the United States and said, we want to trade in our dollars for gold, well, we couldn't do that. Therefore, the US dollar became what they call a fiat currency. What backed the dollar up? Well, what do they call it? The faith and goodwill, I guess, honesty.
Full faith and credit of the United States.
Oh, okay, all right, something like that. Or the fact that everybody would trust the United States government to cooperate with the major players in the global financial system. In other words, the only thing backing the US dollar up is the, what did you say it was? Say that one more
The
time.
full faith and credit
Okay,
of the United States.
of the US government.
Yeah,
Now, see, the other thing is they make up words faster than you can,
yeah.
go to the bathroom. I mean,
It's like postmodernism.
yeah, thank you. Language is everything. So you just can't keep up with it. But anyway, the cost of empire and the dollar being based upon the price of gold and all of that type of thing were incompatible. So the empire took precedence over economic rationality and yada, yada, yada. That was the first big crisis. It seemed not to be a big crisis. But then the next crisis was the oil shock, where all of the oil producing countries, especially in the Middle East, came together and formed what they called OPEC. And they said, we will charge a certain price. They'd been getting ripped off, super ripped off by this low price of oil. And so at some point, the price of oil per barrel went over $100, which meant that a lot of money was coming in to Saudi Arabia, to the Gulf states, and eventually to Iraq, and maybe to Venezuela, Nigeria, Angola. And thus, an agreement is reached between the United States and Saudi Arabia, producing what is called the petrodollar. And this is very important because now the dollar is not just a fiat currency, it is linked to a resource. You don't have gold, so you have oil. Now, the point of all of this is that any nation which wishes to buy oil has to buy it in dollars. You see, so if China wants to buy Saudi oil, or let us say Nigerian oil, or UAE, United Arab Emirate oil, or anywhere, or Russia, the Soviet Union wanted to buy oil, let us say from Iraq or Libya, they would have to buy it in dollars. You see what I'm saying? That was the currency that you could buy because petroleum was valued and priced on the basis of the dollar, not on the basis of the British pound or the French franc. So if you say a barrel of oil, a barrel of petroleum is $50. You don't say 60 euros. Now, this is what got both Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein in problems because they wanted to trade oil in currencies other than the dollar, which would have been destabilizing to the global economy and so on and so forth. Now, but then in the 90s of the last century, the idea of a world economy based upon the principles of neoliberalism, that is, that the world markets in commodities and manufactured goods would operate better if all nations could agree on tariffs, on other things, and on how they would relate their currency. For example, the Chinese renminbi or yuan, whatever you wish to call it, would not be manipulated to make goods that China imports less expensive. Okay? That everybody would agree to allow their currencies to pivot off of the US dollar. And if you don't mind, don't try to understand it all, because I'm even though I'm saying it, I don't. You know what I'm saying? I have to admit that it sounds good, but I don't know what I'm talking about at the time. But anyway, so, but this world arrangement, the first time in human history. The dollar would be the reserve currency, and an overall treaty, would seal the relationships between nations and their economies. And a lot of this would be controlled by the major nations and by a few tiny group of people in those nations that are the real oligarchs, would make decisions about currencies, about other things. China was admitted. And this is very important because since 1972, when Kissinger and Nixon went to China, and this was huge because China is no longer seen as an isolated, sanctioned, impoverished country. And then in 1979, when full diplomatic relations were established between China and the United States, and then Deng Xiaoping's what they call opening up. By the way, I don't see it as that, as just, oh, we're opening up as though we closed ourselves off to begin with. That is not the story. Again, I don't want to curse because I'm in a church, but that's look. China didn't isolate itself. It was the West and the United States that isolated China in order to overthrow the revolutionary government, to further impoverish the people, to create discontent, and then so on. The US and China came to a rapprochement vis-a-vis their economies. And without China, you do not have the neoliberal world economic order. China is the foundation of it because China increasingly became what they call the workshop of the world. In other words, China manufactured things that were bought in the largest consumer market in the world, the United States, but also Europe and other advanced countries. So China forwent its domestic consumption in the interest of accumulating capital based upon producing cheaply and selling more expensively to the advanced capitalist countries and their consumers. Okay? So if you went back to the 1950s or 60s or even before that, most of what Americans bought was produced in the United States. Right. Now, most of what Americans buy is not produced in the United States. This is the neoliberal order, and China is foundational to it. It doesn't work without China. Now, China has certain things that predisposed it to being in this position. One, a stable government, which the West likes to call authoritarian. Yes. You know what I'm saying? A lot of it's just rooted in the civilization of China, where the Confucianist philosophy, you know what I'm saying? Where people respect order, respect authority until they don't respect it, you know what I'm saying? But they, and so this is built in. So people trusted the government, and then there were benefits that people saw, including most significantly the anti-poverty program, the urbanization and modernization of Chinese society. And people saw these gains almost immediately, which legitimated the Communist Party government. And that legitimacy remains up to this day. But let me say again, U.S. capital ceased to invest in the United States and began to invest in China. Big time. Now, the other agenda was that, and then of course, by the way, capital went there, and students, hundreds of thousands of Chinese students came to the United States to study. You know what I'm saying? And in the process, were not only educated technically, but were socialized to Western values. That's what all of y'all kind of see the remnants of when you go to China and say, I don't like the Chinese. I'm quoting Alice now. Because, I'm just saying, that westernization process. Hundreds of, and they were all in the elite universities. They were in the Ivy League, but not only, but the Ivy Leagues, MIT, Harvard, and they were great students. They knew why they were here, and most of them went back. All of them didn't, and some of them are y'all's parents, you know. But anyway, many of this. That's a whole nother story. I was going to quote a Bobby Blue Bland song. But anyway, so they stayed here, and they became completely westernized, completely Americanized, and a part of the professional managerial class. But most went back. And now, with the crisis of U.S. society, more are going back than it's coming here to stay. But so you have these two flows. Now, and then Deng Xiaoping, with his statements, money is a beautiful thing, get paid, but his basic statement was this: socialism that just reproduced poverty could not win anybody to its side, including the Chinese people. So China had to find an economic model that on the one side fit into this global neoliberal system, and on the other side could provide for its people. So what China develops is what we call a socialist market economy. Most of the Chinese central industries, universities, technology, all of that is state owned. The major banks in China are all state banks. However, there is still space for the entrepreneur, like, wasn't it Joe Ma or Jack Ma? I was going to say Bill Ma, but Bill Ma. But he kind of disappeared from sight for a while. He got out of hand. But anyway, so this part of their economy, which is private, a lot of it is foreign investment, a lot of it is foreign corporations like Apple and other computer firms and others. I don't know all of them. But you have these two systems which have to be coordinated, the private sector, but the much larger state sector, And, along with that, the social contract. We will defeat poverty. And they did that. Okay? Everybody will have a good home to live in, a good apartment, which kind of, got the economy in some trouble, overinvestment, heating up, and so on. But these are normal problems of a huge economy. However, the US planners were hoping that China would eventually abandon communism for something that looked like social democracy or liberalism. And they hoped to do in China what they had done in the Soviet Union. But it's something about the Chinese mentality. They don't bend that easy, as we're seeing today. And in spite of the fact that the two leaders that followed Deng Xiaoping kind of were strategic Uncle Toms, as far as I was concerned. You know, what do y'all call him? Uncle who?
Uncle Tim.
Uncle Tim. Uncle Tim's. You know, I mean, just too much. And then in 2012, a new leadership emerges, and that's Xi Jinping. And he's recognized as that the two eras, the era of Mao, the era of Deng Xiaoping, and now the era of Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping, while working within this neoliberal world order and China's place in it, they were able, some really significant strategic economists, who learned to play the game better than the Americans, and they did. And that's why, in a lot of ways, the Americans are so, oh, you cheated. No, we didn't cheat. We just knew your system better than you did, and we planned, because, see, this is the other thing, the concept of economic planning. Okay, we're in this global system where there is not an economic plan, but we are playing the economy in a global neoliberal system. And so they made it work spectacularly for them. I mean, it's kind of amazing. But all the time, see, it's not just economics. There's also the Chinese people. There's also the political system. Now, during the time of Xi, everything after the Cultural Revolution, corruption went mad. You know, corruption became normalized. And literally, the way I was looking at it, that you accepted a certain amount of corruption in order to achieve some other ends. Okay, so if you got these corrupt gangsters that run corporations or have a store down the street or do other things, let them live in the bigger system. But then Xi Jinping, especially in his second and third terms, first of all, he changed the constitution because they had instituted this idea of you can only be the president for 2 terms. He said, man, come on, that ain't the way we work here. We ain't never worked that way. You know what I'm saying? You stay until the thing of heaven.
Mandate.
The mandate of heaven brings your butt down. You know? But so they changed that. So I think now he's in his third 5-year term, and they've gotten a lot done. But they had to uproot corruption, and it took him more than a decade to uproot corruption from the state and the Communist Party, which he and they understood was part of what brought the Communist Party of the Soviet Union down. And the other thing is that the political system had to be off limits to the West. In other words, you're not coming up in here dictating how we run our elections. You're not going to alter the relationship of the Communist Party to the state or to the society as a whole. In fact, we're going to tighten that relationship as we move forward to consolidate our political system. But they had to get that political system under control, and control of the media, where debate can go on, but it's not going to be determined by U.S. What they call was it Institute of the National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA, and all of that. They require a certain patriotism, a bottom line patriotism. They were not going to sacrifice their civilization, although it is just some problems, to perform for the West, to get the West talking about, oh, look, they're democratic. Oh, look, they had a gay pride parade the other day. Oh, they're beautiful. No, they had to establish who they were. And that's part of Xi Jinping, the new Chinese identity. I think, and I learned this from you, Kathy, your observations. Now, okay, I know I'm going on too much. And so China and BRICS and the Belt and Road and the China-Russia Strategic Alliance and now the China-Russia-Iran-North Korea Alliance, China's soft power in Africa and in Latin America. China has become, well, first of all, it's the second biggest economy. And if you use other measures, it might be the largest economy. It is more or less debt free. In other words, the government doesn't have huge debt. They're very frugal, as are the people. They don't want to just consume, borrow. They like to buy something and pay for it, even a house or a car. You know what I'm saying? Very different than the West. So it's a more stable environment and growing in influence and the economy growing, while the Western economies, including the United States, were falling deeper into crises produced by the neoliberal financialized system. We will make money off of money, not off of commodities. To get rich just because you position right in terms of money markets. I mean, it's a total disgrace. And never before done like that. But let me not keep it back and forth. But the thing is that ultimately, Trump comes to office and he says, in his mind, I will do what previous presidents, and he's basically going back to George W. Bush up through Obama and then Biden. He's talking about a 20-year span. What they knew was wrong, what could not continue if the United States were to be the hegemon, but they wouldn't do anything, he felt. And he comes and saying, I will act and I will act this thing. Can you see the problem? And he does face a huge problem, even with his limited knowledge base and competency base and a limited cabinet. Them people he got, they don't know shit from Shinola. They just, you know what I'm saying? I mean, anybody that says that's the dumbest cabinet ever assembled in the history of the United States, that's not hyperbole. It is a bunch of dumb people. But he is not governing in a normal way. He is, as we've suggested before, his form of governing is Bonapartism. I am the state and the state is me. And kind of that's what he says. I'm untouchable. I can lock up whoever I want. I can deport whoever I want. I was elected to do certain things and I'm going to do it. I'm not going through the courts. I'm not going through the law. And my interpretation is that the presidency is above normal constitutional constraints, if any constraints, by the way. If you recall, his inaugural speech was an attack upon the state, the government, the state bureaucracy. That's basically any elites, which kind of got them upset. Okay, let me get to the short game. Destabilize the existing system. Long game. Negotiate with major powers economically and militarily in the world to create a new system out of the bringing down of the old system. There is no other way to look at this tariff thing but a shock to the existing system. Okay? Then, when the contradictions of that, and first and foremost, the bond markets hitting a panic, which they could not afford because those are the markets that the US government in the main goes to borrow money to keep the government running. It's a very fragile system, frankly. And how much could the US state afford to pay to borrow money without collapsing in upon itself? There are deep problems here, separate from Trump. But he sees himself as addressing them. Okay. And you can't go by all the time by what he says or how he performs. You have to see the objective crisis and his attempting to address the crisis. The crisis would occur without him or with him. It was a crisis waiting to explode. Okay, so when the bond markets panic, he steps back and says, I'm going to have a 90-day cooling off period, and I'll only keep 10% on tariffs across the board. But they're more than that because he's already put tariffs on Mexico and Canada, two of the US's main allies, and he had already put tariffs on aluminum and steel and other things from Europe. So the 10% is on top of the existing tariffs. What they are, it's hard to calculate, but it is this dealing with friends and foes as though everybody is an economic enemy of the United States. Now, I mean, it's good theater, even comedic, to tell you the truth. In other words, the United States has been carrying all of the world economy all these years, and we have been ripped off, raped, abused. You know, the guy, maybe he was brought up in a family, you know, his father was an alcoholic. Maybe his father beat him too much because he has a persecution complex, I think. Or is he just performing that? You don't know. But at any rate, if the world is the enemy, but the way I read it is the old system no longer meets the needs of the American economy, of the American nation. Let me put it that way. The old system that favored the United States and the US dollar for all of these years had exhausted itself and no longer did that. Now, let's take a step back. The US working class. The US working people, because of deindustrialization, the flatlining of wages and incomes, and were angrier than anyone had ever seen them. Even during the Great Depression, people were fed up. They hated the politicians hate, and this was across the board. And they saw the root of it in two things: deindustrialization and wars. People had, wrote them off as a force. And, we had talked about it here often, the U.S. working people as a geostrategic force. I want to show you how that is being played out. And that's why so much of what you can read in these essays, these articles in the New York Times, are, as they say, boring. Because you're not talking about the people. You're talking about the elite system. Okay. If there is not a reindustrialization of the American economy, at least some steps towards that, the American working class was going to rise up. Now, whether it would be a full revolution or a civil war, it's hard to say, but would rise up against the elites whom they hate. They voted in a large measure for Trump because they hated the opposition. They hated the way the elites looked down on them, looked down on their cultural values, the simple things. You know what I'm saying? I go to church, don't have see, everybody ain't into same sex bathrooms. I know I'm not, like at the Asian Arts Initiative. I mean, look, Jack, you got what the men use to pee in, and then you got the place where the women going, and we all in the same spot. I like to have I don't like to be in the bathroom with a woman that I don't know. You see what I'm saying? But that's enough. But this whole idea that we would give you new cultural values when we couldn't give you an income to eat, when we couldn't educate your children, where you're doing worse every year and your children have no future. People had it up to their necks. Therefore, when Trump attacks universities, ain't nobody mad. Now he kowtows to the evil Zionists with this attack upon student demonstrators, but really only a few. The real attack is upon the elite universities, the Ivy League. Okay, and they use this veil of anti-Semitism. You see what I'm saying? But that's bullshit, because the elites that he's attacking are disproportionately Jewish and Zionists. So who's the anti-Semite? The student demonstrators for Palestine weren't attacking the elites that way. They were asking for disinvestment. Don't invest in industries in Israel that promote genocide. But going after the money of the universities, who has benefited from that? I won't mention Purba's advisor at Penn, sometimes associated with an animal.
Not my advisor.
Or your associate, Hogley, but disproportionately, Jews and Zionists benefit from these research grants. So by attacking that is a more severe attack upon Jews and their interests and their position in the social hierarchies than student demonstrators. But you see how you have to have a veil. It looks like I'm going after all of this liberalism on the university campuses. And I'm going, I got two or three students I'm going to deport back to their countries and all that nonsense. But the real deal, what he's really hitting, is the elites. Okay? the elites who, their smugness look with contempt upon the ordinary person. You know what I'm saying? You can see what's going on behind the veil. This tariff situation is actually an attack upon the financial oligarchy, the banks, that tiny, let's keep it 100. The people that make the decisions about the US banking and financial system, they all about the number of people we got sitting right here. This ain't no big time democratic process. It is a oligarchy running or having the power to control everything from who you can vote for city council to the presidency. The ultimate power is in the hands of a very, very few people. And any discourse that talks otherwise is BS to obscure the true nature of the networks of political, economic, and financial power in this country. To change the financialized global system we call neoliberalism is an attack upon the main centers of financial power, especially in New York and the London banks. That is the core of the global financial oligarchy. Everybody, including Xi Jinping, country of 1.5 billion people. Gee, why you have to step lightly because of their control. This is South Korea, the madman that tried to pull off a coup. Is he still in jail?
Oh, well, they impeached him.
Yeah, but did they keep him in jail though?
I think now they can prosecute him in a criminal
Okay,
case.
cool. He needs to be locked up. But I didn't think the dude was. I told Jerry and Nuri, because he came off as such a, like a comedic figure. I said, "Oh, that cat is just bullshit." But no, he was serious as a heart attack. But so I'm gonna shut up in a minute. But see, my point is this: if you attack the neoliberal order, who are you ultimately attacking? Are you attacking a faceless social structure, or are you attacking those who have the power to run this social arrangement? Who will be the losers and who has more to gain? Does that make sense? Who loses in this attack? Now, I'm not saying that it's going to work, but when the stock market goes into the panic that it went into in the last couple of weeks, that is not to be taken lightly. Because that ain't just traders on the floor. Oh, I'm going to, and I'm on the phone with my. No. First of all, it's all computerized. It's all AI these days. You know what I'm saying? So if one thing happens, it triggers multiple sell-offs. So who made the decision for the first sell-off? Somebody made a decision that led to other things happening. Now, Trump is smart enough and knows about money and stuff like that to know that a few people decide all of this. Hence, when he goes after the elites, well, the universities are not minor places. They are connected and are think tanks for the state and the money markets, the financial system, and so on. You know what I'm saying? All of the people that run these big financial institutions and money markets and hedge funds and all those things we hear about are educated in elite universities. They remain connected to elite universities. They remain connected to the professors at Wharton who taught them about money markets. So it is this, what we call these networks, these feedback loops. See what I'm saying? Once you're in the loop, you're in the loop. Unless you hook up, then you might have to be eliminated from the loop. But these are positive, talk about positive feedback loops. Okay? Okay. Now, war and peace. Okay. We saw Trump, which was, a moment of celebration and, as they say, as Al Green used to say in the song, joy and happiness, when he B-slapped Zelensky. When he B-slapped him. Said, damn, that's it. Which was a message being sent to European countries who had become, because of Trump's interruption of aid to Zelensky in the spring of 2024, you remember that whole thing in Congress, it was a slap to the European Union. And their assumptions about this proxy war using Ukrainians to fight Russia, to bring Russia down, to do to Russia and Putin what they did to Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and that's another story. But the point was, this was not a war for the independence of Ukraine. It was a war directed against Russia. And they were prepared, along with the Biden administration, to go to the brink of nuclear war. Believe me. So people say, oh, I just have to tell this story. A friend of mine called me up. He said, man, I was listening to WURD, and a cat just called in there. I'm talking together. That's the way he took. Cat just called in there and said that he had a friend that voted for Trump, and then when he see the friend at Whole Foods, he walks away from it. So my friend called and said, "Was he talking about you?" I said, "Sound like it." Given the cat that made the statement, yeah, he said whenever he see me in Whole Foods, he run. I said, "You think I'm running from you and your simple ass self." But but anyway, well, I say that to say that there cannot be any discussion of any of this. If you get Kamala Harris, you continue the nuclear brinksmanship in the center of Europe against the largest, along with the United States, nuclear weapon state. And the Europeans had said that they will never negotiate with Russia, that Russia has to be seen as a pariah state that must be isolated. Trump comes in, and the first thing he does is to begin the normalization with Putin and to discuss with Putin peace in Ukraine. Okay. Now, that's not everything. We're not home safe. But it is not the same level of war and nuclear possibility with the Biden administration. I don't care how hip Kamala Party Girl Harris try to be. See all that old hip shit, that's just a cover. The real deal is Blinken and Sullivan and the rest of them were carrying out a policy to break the Putin regime, and they were prepared to first of all, take the war into Russia and to use the most advanced missiles and even nuclear weapons in this regard. All that talk of Zelensky coming over here regularly, oh, y'all got to give me more missiles, and I need a nuclear bomb. You remember how Zelensky was cutting his behind? You heard anything from him lately? Tell the truth. He done went into chill mode. You know? Yeah, he's in chill mode because just to keep it 100, he got to be careful because the cats he dealing with, the Azov battalion, all them cats, they known killers. That's what they do. You know, everybody got to be a little bit concerned, because some cats go anywhere in the world and kill you. So now they got to get Zelensky out. That's all I'm trying to say. We had never been that close to nuclear war, even during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Never. And they could smile and act like, oh, I'm just a nice black sister from Oakland, and my mother took me in the civil rights marches and all that bullshit. No, you was a front for a very dangerous administration. So anybody got anything to say about why everybody didn't vote for Kamala Harris, I got an explanation for you. If you want to know, you know my phone number. And if you want, we can discuss it publicly. There ain't no shame in my game. You dig where I'm coming from? So, I'm talking too much. Okay, we backed away from that. But then you still have Israel. I won't say one of the most dangerous, one of the most 2 or 3 most dangerous states in the world. Now you talking about mad people running a country? Israel. You talking about a Nazi type ideology? Extreme Zionism. Everybody admits it now. You talk about genocide? Hey. So to what extent and how far is Trump going to go with these people? He sent conflicting messages. On the one hand, he reposts Jeffrey Sachs's thing. Now, just a couple of quick things. He unleashed Israel to continue its mass murder in Gaza. This is the problem of amorality, no morality, immorality. Inexcusable. I don't care how much benefit of the doubt I'm going to give you on certain other questions. You're immoral. You could see them children, and then you're going to talk about turning the place into a resort area and getting all the Gazans out of there. No, dog, the very fact that you said it, whether you intended that for reality or not, you said it. And you can never be excused for that. However, as you know, Netanyahu was in the United States meeting with Trump, I think this past week, his second visit since Trump's inauguration. It was not happy days are here again. Trump did not bow down and lick his boots. In fact, as I understand things, on I think 4 points, Trump disagreed deeply with Netanyahu. First of all, the tariffs that Trump has imposed on Israel, 17%. You know what I'm saying? That was not canceled. Secondly, Netanyahu wanted Trump to come out against Erdogan, the head of state of Turkey, which he did not do. Oh, as you know, today, the United States and Iran are in indirect talks. Netanyahu wanted Trump to back out of that because, see, talks is a way of normalizing relationships. And this is hugely important. So he did, in some ways, to Netanyahu what he had done to Zelensky. Um, and this is important. Now, Netanyahu wants an all-out war against Iran. Trump doesn't, it seems. He wants to negotiate out of this, but Trump also knows what everybody knows, that Netanyahu will not be long as the prime minister of Israel. Israel's society has convulsed, the economy is collapsing, and so on. So you cannot make any long-term arrangements with Netanyahu. Netanyahu wants a regional war beginning with an attack upon Iran. Trump doesn't, because Trump thinks he can work to rearrange Western Asia, working through Saudi Arabia, and more what they call moderate Arab regimes. Netanyahu wants to totally colonize all of the Arab world because he is a racist, and the racism is manifested in a violent anti-Arabism, expressed most violently towards the Palestinians. And what Netanyahu cannot stand is that moderate governments like Saudi Arabia or like Turkey, which is not Arab but is Muslim, are speaking up not only in public and diplomatic circles, but through the United Nations and the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. You dig what I'm saying? Which makes Israel then the most isolated and, in fact, hated nation in the world. Good. Okay? Trump is not that dumb. But I just want to make this point. Indirect. Now, Trump says direct relation. He's sent over there as a chief negotiator, a real estate Zionist. And I'm telling you, you cannot say, well, you have good Zionists and bad Zionists. No. It's just like saying, you got a good Nazi and a bad. No. Your ideology is evil. I don't care how nice you treat your children and wife, so on and so forth. But now they face Iran. That is not what it was 10 years ago. You hit Iran, they can hit you back, including the United States. Diego Garcia, which is this highly militarized island in the Indian Ocean, which is where they're sending all of these planes and bombs to threaten Iran. That could be hit with the quickness. All them aircraft carriers are sitting duck. You know what I'm saying? Okay. They know it's no win there. Now, you can run off at the mouth all you want. You can perform tough guy, but ain't nobody, we call it selling wolf tickets, but ain't nobody buying them. Iran said, we come, but don't F with us. Okay? Now, the Houthis. Okay, then he began a new war against the Houthis in the Red Sea. You're going to jump up in there like that. Okay, you killed some civilians, but you ain't did nothing to our capacity, our missiles, to hit your warships, your aircraft carriers, and to make it difficult, if not impossible, for nations to do normal mercantile trade with Israel, especially Europeans who go through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea to get to Israel. Okay, so you attack them, and my man Yahya, who was the spokesman for the Houthis, I love that. And, I knew a couple cats named Yahya here in Philadelphia. Yeah, that's an Arab name. So I'm always, I have a soft spot for anybody named Yahya. I like that, but they don't say it like we say it in the hood, yeah. But anyway, um, and he said, by the will of God, hey, you ain't did nothing. And we have missiles that can reach Israel. We have missiles that can reach your aircraft carriers wherever they would be in the Red Sea. But now, I don't know whether this is an unintended or an intended consequence of this recent attack upon Yemen, but the real harm is done to the European countries. Now, here you got sanctions on the Europeans, you got attack in the Red Sea that affects European commercial trade, not only to Israel, but also to other Arab nations. Okay? Now, okay, let me just end on this. There's so many moving parts, believe me. And I think not to try to understand many of the moving parts and many of the dynamics would be just laziness and trifles. You know what I'm saying? China's a huge moving part, huge. I think ultimately Trump will back down before Xi Jinping does. Has to, you know. However, I feel now this is just, and you just don't know everything because these cats that he got, the Secretary of the Treasury and another secretary, these people, they don't look like they graduated more than from kindergarten. Just dumb. But anyway, so Trump is the decider in the equation. Economic war with China will hurt America more than China. China's economy, China's political system, China's, situation of the people vis-a-vis the government is far stronger than the United States. Trump knows that, you know. And the Chinese, and it goes back to their Confucius civilizational values, values I think that y'all take for granted, but they're embedded there. We will not be bullied. When they talk about that 100 years of humiliation, a century of humiliation, they ain't bullshitting about that. That's taught in elementary school. When they talk about the long march and sacrifice, they for real. They are not Americans. You know what I'm saying? They're not looking for the easy way. They have a sense that even though, I know some issues with the youth and American values and individualism and consumerism, but that's them. But the Chinese people, especially the older generation, Y'all ain't, and especially, see, and this is what people don't fully understand, the anti-white supremacists feelings among China. How do you know that it's there? Well, I'll take some instances from history. The visit of W.E.B. Du Bois. Why did we celebrate? Why did we celebrate in China Robeson? Why did we invite the Black Panther Party? You think they don't know the significance of that? That they don't know something about the American struggle and the fight against white supremacy? And as we say, the white man? They do. They might not understand it the way we do. But I say all of that to say, you gonna come talking all that bullshit about China and you a white man? No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think it, so it will have to be a battle. Now, it's what we used to call, when under Deng Xiaoping, when China and the United States and the West came together, that's what we call coupling. The economies coupled. This is a deep, almost sudden decoupling, what we're experiencing. And it had to happen. China had to become more of a domestic and less of an international economy. The Chinese people, let me just a small quick thing. See, first of all, the Chinese people don't buy what they don't have money to buy. The Chinese ordinary consumer. They have to get them people to give up their little bit of their saving and start buying. So the domestic economy, you know what I'm saying? But they're very conservative on that, you know, um, and so on. So part of the decoupling is the expansion of the Chinese domestic market, which everybody in the world wants to get a piece of because you're talking about 1.5 billion people, more people than the United States and the European Union together. This is one of the most, maybe the most important market in the world for everything, including cars, including computers, and well, the Chinese are making their own cell phones. That most Chinese buy. They don't buy iPhone. I mean, all of this. But then the recoupling. When will that come? How it will come? We don't know. I think. Oh man, I don't want to talk. I think what we hear officially from China might not be the final word. I don't think China ever expected that there would not be a decoupling. In fact, it's been going on for some time. I don't think China is all that anti-Trump, as it were. They don't like that big Willie talk, don't threaten us. I don't know who you think you're talking to kind of attitude. But Trump has said previously, and all the time he can't go by what he said, but he did say this during the campaign. The United States will not go to war over Taiwan. That's a basic red line in China. If you will not go to war over Taiwan, hey, we can talk. Trump continually talks about his deep respect for Xi Jinping. This is very important in a Confucianist civilization. It's not like here, where you can diss somebody, get a beef with all that old nonsense. Respect our leader. That's Confucianism. So when he says positive things about Xi, it carries a lot of cultural weight in China. And then when he says, I speak regularly, he could be lying. I speak regularly to Xi Jinping. Highly meaningful, if it is going on. That the lines of communication are that. Look, the head of the EU, what's her name, Jerry? I forget the
Von der Leyen?
Von der Leyen. Von der Leyen. Do lang. She's the head of the European Union. She called Trump. He won't return her call. The foreign minister of the UE was just in the United States, supposed to be on an official visit to talk to Marco Rubio, and they wouldn't meet with her after inviting her. So what Trump is saying, I talk more to Xi Jinping, and he's my friend, and these Europeans are not. You did that. The change in the political atmosphere. And then, of course, okay, let me just end. We've said it, just to end. 53% of the American people in the latest Pew poll say that they disagree with Israel. 53%. Among youth is 71%. By youth, they mean up to 45, and maybe 50, something like that. So I sometimes consider myself a youth, given that kind of thing. But Israel is not seen as a regime that the United States should spend all this money on and protect. Okay. Huge shift, which is a sign of a peace consensus developing. The activist movement, and this is why, and Emily and I were talking about this the other day or yesterday, because some of these nonprofits have this idea that they can diss free school however they want and whenever they want. You know what I'm saying? Invite you and then disinvite you. Or the whole thing of creating these fake free schools and all of that. We know what that represents in the political landscape of the city, because these nonprofits are nothing more than arms of the Democratic Party of the state. I don't care if I like you or don't like you personally. You go a certain way. I interpret it, and I think based upon my own experience, that you're connected to the state and you're but a puppet of their interests. All of this reclaim Philadelphia and all that BS is BS. It is a holding action to keep some kind of demonstrating shit going until the Democratic Party can get itself together. They are weak. The ruling elite is weak. They have no answer to Trump and whatever he does, crazy or not. So all of this going on should be treated in a certain sense with utter contempt. It's going nowhere. It can't go nowhere, and they will only do what they are told. Our work and our thinking must continue the long game, the objective of all of this, and finally, as I've tried to say, I don't know that I made it clear, we're looking, I think, at a more rapid undoing of the old system of American hegemony. If Trump doesn't know anything, I think he understands. Empire is too expensive. That $38 trillion sovereign debt, by which they mean government debt, the interest on it is as much as the military budget. It's a long game. This system will collapse. The elite will face the anger and desire for retribution against the elites, and so on. So I'll stop there. Forgive me for talking too long.
Well, actually, before I get to Ross Douthat, I just had a couple of things that I was thinking about as we were talking. And I think that, I go into Penn every day and I'm constantly interacting with students, graduate students, postdocs, as well as, advisors in various settings of, meetings, run-ins, etc., etc. In the elevator, while walking down hallways, everybody has the same thing on their mind, which is Trump budget cuts, budget cuts to the NIH and how their research will be affected. And I find it really interesting because some of these people I know, and when I engage with them, they're obviously extremely insecure. They're afraid what is going to happen to me. And when I try to engage with them and I ask them, well, do you think what is happening? What do you think about what is happening? And they always respond in a negative, that this is something that the current destabilization, if you will, of the educational institutions, of health institutions, now that RFK is at the head of the Department of Health, it's all bad, it's all going wrong, it's all being destabilized. But then when you ask them, well, was what we had any better? That's when you don't really get a very clear answer. Because, of course, they are in these liberal institutions, and these are mostly students that I'm talking about, who are also a little left-leaning, you can say, and they are very aware that, well, you can't really say anything good about the old system, but you also can't say anything good about the destabilization of the old system. Because, and that is how I sort of I'm trying to see how these people are thinking. And I feel like being in these elite educational institutions really prevents you from thinking on your own. You have so many different influences from so many different sides that you can't really reason out what's happening on the broader scale of things. And I was thinking about my brother. He's been trained in an American institution, and the last time I spoke to him, he was very upset because apparently he lost a lot of money in the stock market.
Okay.
And well, and then I was reading about the stock market collapse and everything, and I came across this report which said that, well, 44 to 48% of all Americans don't even invest in the US stock market. They're not affected, right? And then And even then, when you consider that percentage, 44 to 48% Americans have no investment portfolio, and then you have to consider a larger percentage of people, maybe up to 80% or even 85%, who have like very small portfolios. They're like investing in the stock market, but not by that much. But then you have the big players in like that upper 10% who maybe lost a lot, you know, and those are the people who are probably writing all these articles in the Financial Times and the New York Times, right? So I was very, very, I don't know, I've just been thinking a lot about what all of this means. And I think 2 days ago, the Ross Dowsett had a podcast. He has a podcast now, and he had on Cass, I think, who's the chief economist of a think tank called American Compass. And that conversation 2 days ago, like, of course, Dowsett was kind of trying to play the devil's advocate. He was trying to say that, well, all of these things that are happening economically, financially, these broad movements, what do they mean? And do you really think that it's going to benefit anybody? And Oren Cass is sort of, I'll be very brief about this, but he kind of says that, well, you know, that for a long time, people sort of believed that this rising tide will benefit everybody kind of philosophy is going to get everybody across the finish line, make everybody prosperous. But that didn't happen. It took a long time for people to understand that we are going down a path of decay. And it took a long time for this decay to occur. And so I think his point was that deindustrialization was kind of the start of something which exponentially over the last 50 years caused the US to sort of flatline economically, industrially, except from a very, I don't know, from a very stock markety point of view, I don't know how else to put it, that the America was getting richer and richer and richer visually, if you look at numbers and everything, but material conditions of the people of the country, the poor, were not improving. They were actually drastically going down. And that is exactly what I think Oren Cass was trying to say, that you have a sort of disparity between what is the image of the US in terms of raw numbers on money market accounts and what real people are facing in their actual lives. And he's trying to, of course, defend the tariffs. He's trying to, Oren Cass was like, no, these tariffs are there for a reason. Things are always going to get a lot worse before they get better. And this is an attempt by Trump to sort of make people get manufacturing jobs back into the United States. And this is an interesting point, because I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about, you know, all the people who are calling Trump a fascist, and I was thinking that, well, he is using tariffs, but I don't think in the last 3 months he's ever used sanctions
He has
on.
Russia. Sorry.
No, I mean, I wasn't probably aware of this, but I've been hearing so much about tariffs. But you know, in the previous government, in the Biden administration, we had a lot more sanctions. We had a lot more cutting off of economies from other economies, a lot of restriction of trade and flow of money. But this is something different. It's something different fundamentally to how the US has operated in the past, I feel. And I think today I woke up and Ross Douthat had an article today, had a very interesting title, which was like, "How many times can Trump tempt fate?" And you can really hear the frustration in his voice now. I think over the last 2 days, he has. I feel like he's saying that, well, during the first Trump administration, I wrote Trump off as some lunatic, and I was like, whatever he's doing, it won't lead to any good. But eventually, it did lead to some good. It led to an economic growth. It led to more jobs and like an overall upliftment of the material lives of people. And I initially thought that like he should be the one who's removed, but now I'm like, Biden actually deserves that spot. Like Biden should not have been the president for 4 years. And when Trump came into power this time, I sort of resolved that I will not judge him that quickly. I will sort of not let whatever he does in the first couple of months or even a year sort of bias me towards what is about to happen. I think that reminded me a little bit of your long game and short game analogy. But then in this article, he's like, I think my patience is, I feel like he was trying to say my patience is being tested over the last 2 days, where reciprocal tariffs were sort of going back and forth between China and the US. And all of these measures that are affecting the US economy and prices and everything. So I think that his point in the article from today is that Trump needs to take a more moderate position. That I think he had a lot of examples. Like, yes, you promised the people of your country who chose you, who elected you, who voted for you, that you would do something about illegal immigration, and you are deporting people. That's great. However, you can't deport people straight off to jail in El Salvador.
Yeah, right.
You're defunding DEI programs, but you're also attacking students on campus for their political beliefs, which we talked about. And you're sort of curbing, you're putting tariffs on countries in the hope that you will bring manufacturing jobs back, but that can't be at the cost of people suffering. But when I read this article, and today's discussion also helped me sort of think that I think Douthit is also sort of thinking short term.
Yes.
And he's thinking about the short game, and he's not really being able to. I also don't see the long game very honestly, but there must be one. I don't really understand what the end goal is, but I do agree that whatever Trump is doing, like we were talking about, it's creating these conditions for people to sort of rise up. And maybe Europe is not the only place where we'll see a kind of civil war or an uprising of workers. We'll probably see it here as well too. Now, what I'm obviously very confused about how much of this are intended consequences and how much of these are unintended consequences, and I really don't have an answer. But I think that at the end of the day, 3 months into Trump's presidency, we have seen a massive shift from what was to what is. I think that now I see I was hearing that Kamala Harris is trying to run for governor of California again, but I do think you're right, Doc. I think that if the Democrats just want somebody like Biden and or Harris to sort of continue what has been, a collapsing U.S. empire, and which would end somehow. I don't know how this current destabilization, this sort of injection of chaos almost into the current system is going to change what is happening. But I do know that it's going to have to come from the people somehow, which is why I wanted to say that I feel like listening to Alex Trainer and Glenn Deason and everybody, they're like, yeah, it has to sort of come organically. But I feel like even though the destability is being caused by Trump, and the system is being upended or uprooted, whatever replaces it has to come from the people, the way that it probably did in China. And so, yeah, I have other thoughts about the US-China thing, but I'll let Jeremiah come in.
Yeah, I think actually this conversation and the way that we're talking about Trump, it reminded me of this chapter that we read recently in Bandung in the Souls of Black Folk called the Training of Black Men, where Du Bois starts the chapter by talking about American history through the lens of like these three streams of thought, as he calls them, one of which is kind of the general, almost universal thought of modernity, of Western modernity, of the interconnection of the planet through trade and all that stuff. And then he has the other stream of thought, which is like the basically white supremacist mode of thought, which emerges in the United States. And then he says the thought of things themselves, which is Black folk, or the thought of those who are seen as things. And so he talks about these three streams, but that also behind those streams, behind that major thought is what he calls the afterthought, which is the questioning, the doubt. And then, like, for instance, for Black people, it's like, oh, like, on the one hand, Black people, Black folk will say, we are men, we are human beings, and we deserve to be free. But then he says, at the back of that, there's an afterthought of like, oh, maybe the white world was right about us. And, this is also the kind of language of double consciousness. But I think part of how I try to make sense of Trump is that he's both thought and afterthought. But the question is, which is the dominant thought and which is the afterthought? Because sometimes it seems like the anti-war part of Trump is the main thought, and then he has these afterthoughts of basically like whiteness and all that stuff. But it's like also like which is more dominant in any given situation. But yeah, so okay, so I'm supposed to talk about Adam 2s, I guess. But I guess I just wanted to add to like the general conversation, just because like everyone, I think I've been listening to a lot of podcasts and a lot of commentators around the whole tariff situation and the economic situation, and I think like a lot of the chatter in whether it's the alternative media or the mainstream media is this question of like, does Trump have a grand strategy, or is it all just chaos and his impulses? Is this just a way for Trump to get rich from gaming the stock market, for example? Is Trump stupid, or is this really all just the art of the deal? All that stuff, and actually, like I think there's probably a mix of all of that in play in the whole situation, and I guess maybe that's like the whole thing of like law and chance too, with like Du Bois. But I think the other thing, which I think is very clear, which I think both of you talked about, is that when we even talk about this whole thing of like finance and economics, I think it's important to emphasize that the economic field is ultimately really a battleground for politics, both at the domestic and the international scale, and that it's intensely ideological. You can see this with like the whole stock market thing. It's like none of these people who are investing in stocks, like no one really knows. Like it's not really even about rational interest. It's more about basically, like one's belief in a certain system, one's belief in the United States, for example, as this safe haven for economic value and for long-term interest and all that stuff. But a lot of it is basically ideological. It's psychological. It's not. You can't explain it all through rational, rational actors. Because obviously Trump himself is not a purely rational actor, but neither are the ruling elite. The ruling elite themselves are not rational either, purely. But I guess I want to emphasize too the point that you brought up, Doc, of what Trump is emerging as a counterforce against is essentially the social contract of American empire, which is a social contract of the ruling elite are going to give the world, or they're going to say, we are going to have dollar hegemony, deindustrialization, and military empire. And in exchange, we are going to give the American people cheap imported consumer goods and service jobs, and basically, like Shantanu said, market inflation from Wall Street and for the financial sector. And so basically, our social contract is we can expand empire without significantly threatening the appearance of the American way of life. And this is the social contract which is basically exploded in the United States, in which Trump is emerging as a manifestation of that reckoning of that social contract, which has basically dominated both American life and the world for, like you said, the past 70 years since the end of World War II. And I think actually it reminded me of this quote that I think Baldwin has it might be in The Devil Finds Work, but he's like, because he was also talking about the dollar and like dollar hegemony and stuff. And he was like, Baldwin said, at some point, the world is going to demand what's behind the money, what's behind the dollar. And is there really this thing which the U.S. says it has, which backs up the full faith and credit of the dollar, which makes it possible for the dollar to serve as the global reserve currency, or is it basically empty? Is it all thin air? And is it all hype? And basically, we're dealing with that situation. But I think I'm getting this from like people like Twos, but also just like generally like looking at the whole situation. But I think one of the big contradictions with Trump is that on the one hand, Trump wants to maintain dollar hegemony. And he says this a lot. And I think even people like Tucker Carlson, they say this a lot. But it's like you want to maintain the dollar as a global reserve currency and the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. But at the same time, you want to basically reverse the process which is unfolded as a consequence of the dollar as a global reserve currency. And so basically, like you were saying with like the 1970s, it was exactly like the new status of the dollar as the global reserve currency with the full fiat system and the petrodollar, which created the basic structural tendency towards deindustrialization in the first place, along with the warfare state. Because, and this is the way that Adam Tooze explains it, but it's that basically for the past especially since the 1970s, America's biggest export to the world has basically been its own debt, essentially, in which like it's selling it off in the form of treasury bonds, assets, securities, all that stuff. And so the way that Tooze explains it is that you have all these other countries around the world which run a trade surplus with the United States, which ultimately means more goods end up in the US and more dollars end up abroad. Like that's the basic, like when they say a trade deficit, that's the basic equation. And so then with those dollars that end up abroad, other countries then purchase American debt in the form of treasuries, and they hold them as foreign exchange reserves. And so this is also like the whole situation with Russia and Ukraine was that Russia had foreign exchange reserves in US dollar, like in US treasuries, and then the US said, actually, we're going to, I forget exactly what they did, but they basically attacked that and said that actually we hold that money and Russia doesn't hold that money. And so like also you have like China starting to unwind its investments in US bonds and treasuries, which I think is part of the equation of why Trump made the decision that he did. But so what Hughes is saying is that ultimately because America is exporting all of this debt around the world, this ultimately crowds out all of the other American exports, especially manufacturing exports. And I think the thing that I maybe disagree with Hughes about is that it's easy to describe this as a kind of purely structural phenomenon and almost in a neutral sense, but I think it obscures the human factor of the deliberate gutting of American communities by the ruling elite through deindustrialization. But again, the whole contradiction in what Trump is even trying to achieve is that on the one hand, Trump wants a quote unquote weak dollar, which makes it more expensive to buy goods from other countries. And yet at the same time, he wants to maintain the dollar's exorbitant privilege because that's what ultimately holds the US system together, and it prevents the US from defaulting on its debt. Because you can keep the system running, you can keep this whole debt, like this huge, like unprecedented, $36 trillion debt, because the US is the global reserve currency. You can just keep it running almost in perpetuity as long as everyone else buys into the system. So I guess I want to start with that as kind of like also the context too, but the main argument that Tooze makes is that if you basically take the current status of the trade war, in which Trump has imposed a 145% tariff on China, and then China in response has imposed or raised its tariffs to 125% on the US, which was like, crazy numbers. Tooze is saying that if Trump had started with that as the initial thing, like that would have been seen as like crazy. That would have been seen as like a complete shock to the global system. And in some ways, what Tooze is trying to argue is that it's possible that Trump himself or his team could have strategized this so that they start with something which is even more insane and more preposterous, with like these, like 35% tariffs on Vietnam, like all these, like, this whole reciprocal tariff regime, which is not even reciprocal. It's like basically numbers that they like apparently calculated with ChatGPT, stuff like that. But that it's like, because you start with an even more insane proposition, and maybe this is the art of the deal, then when you scale back from that, and then you are left with just the like main tariffs against China, that seems like almost like a relief to people. And then in that sense, you're able to stabilize the financial system somewhat, because then people are like, oh, actually, it's just China. Now we're just targeting China and we're not targeting the rest of the world, and we only have this 10% tariff on the rest of the world. But Tooze points out that actually the cost to US consumer goods with 145% tariff on goods could ultimately be targeted against China, could ultimately be more costly than even the Liberation Day tariffs of like China plus the rest of the world, because the share of US-China trade is so monumental and so vast. But actually, Trump just announced, though, that they're going to exempt, I think, smartphones and computers.
They're going to do.
They're going to exempt smartphones and computers from the whole tariff regime. So, so I think that like it complicates things. But I think what Tooze is basically arguing is that Trump went full maximalist on this whole Liberation Day tariff regime, and then you wind it back, and then you're left with basically the primary focus being the US-China thing, and then that is what becomes the main focus for the Trump administration, which I think that is basically true, which is that the US is like Trump in particular is going to focus a lot on China and on the like US-China trade war, even though there's like concessions and all that, but I think the other part of this too is that Trump basically bet that the US stock market instability, because of his whole Liberation Day tariff announcement, would lead to people selling off stocks from the stock market, let's say like S&P 500, and then make more purchases of US Treasury bonds, because that's usually seen as the more stable investment compared to the private sector stocks. But then actually what ended up happening is that there was this really dramatic and abnormal sell-off of US Treasury bonds, which means that ultimately people don't see the US Treasury market as this kind of stable long-term investment, and the kind of all of that is predicated on like Trump's own belief and the market's belief on like US exceptionalism, in which the US is seen as this reliable, trustworthy store of value for the global economy. And so that, I think, is part of also the equation in which I do think Trump panicked, because he didn't expect the treasury market to have a sell-off along with the stock market, because it's supposed to be kind of inverse, where it's like stock market goes up, treasury market goes down, but then both treasuries and the stock market were both going down at the same time. And so like I think that's part of what pushed Trump to make that like kind of decision of like, oh, okay, we're gonna scale back or we're gonna pause on the Liberation Day tariffs against the rest of the world. But I guess the main parts that I also want to talk about was this whole idea or the prospect of US-China decoupling, which you pointed out has already been in the process. But what Trump has essentially accelerated is like a hard decoupling between the US and China on trade, which I think will have massive impacts on the global economy. And I think that the basic strategy that Trump is trying to pursue is isolating China in the global trade system. And it was kind of funny because I was listening to the Wall Street Journal's daily podcast, and they were doing this whole piece on China, and then they were also interviewing this Chinese accented woman who is supposedly an expert on China. And so this is the Wall Street Journal. And so in the middle of the podcast, I'm like, oh my God, we have breaking news. Trump has announced he's going to pause the rest of these global tariffs, and then he's going to only attack China with its 125% tariff. And then this Chinese reporter lady was like, "Oh my gosh, this is so crazy." And then she's like, and then the host is like, "Oh, do you think that the U.S. has a stronger hand?" And then the Chinese woman's like, "Definitely, I think the U.S. has a stronger hand here." And like, wow, Trump has made such a masterful move of isolating China and all this stuff. And like, obviously, like, yeah, so like this is part of like, yeah, the internal propaganda of the U.S. willingly. But I think even if Trump's strategy is to isolate China, like that strategy is also failing. It's already failing. And actually, Russia was in some ways the prelude to all of this, because it's like, if the US thought that basically through economic means suffocate the Russian state and the Russian economy and bring the Russian state down, that failed. So why do you think that you can do that against China, which is like, yeah, like hundreds of millions of more people, an economy that is like substantially larger than Russia, and it's basically the largest economy in the world. And so like, if you think that you can make it work against like Russia and then you fail, why do you think that you can make it work against China? And this is also, yeah, like where the question of like BRICS comes into play, and even like the China and the EU having kind of being forced to like forge their own trade deals in the midst of this. And I do think that this falls within the category of unintended consequences for Trump, because I do think that Trump basically has, even if he's willing to make certain concessions with China, I think his primary goal is to basically have a hard decoupling, and to basically, I think he wants to inflict economic pain onto China also. And I think that, and it's both Trump, but also like there's like this huge apparatus of like anti-China hawks and people who basically think that China is like the main enemy of the United States within the administration. And the last thing I wanted to say was about, yeah, this whole thing of reindustrialization, where Tooze argues that the vision of reindustrialization, and this gets into what we're talking about, like the whole long game, and like what does Trump have a long game, which is that, so this is Tooze's argument that the vision of reindustrialization that Trump is promising is largely imaginary, or it's largely fictional, along with being unfeasible. And I think that it's worth considering this, because I think this is what when we talk about Trump walking backwards into the future, I do think that it's true that even if what Trump is after is reindustrialization, his vision for it is largely a vision of the past. And so that's why he has to rely on like, yeah, the 19th century tools in order to achieve 21st century gains for the United States. And also it's like based on this vision of American industry, which is like kind of, yeah, pre-World War II and all that stuff. But yeah, this also gets to like Warren Cass's whole argument, which is that like, I do think that there's a significant part of the American people that would say, I'm willing to accept short-term pain in exchange for a long-term benefit of a revitalization of American manufacturing. But the question is, yeah, like, are there even going to be long-term benefits to the Trump strategy? And basically, can you reverse 5 decades of deindustrialization in the span of weeks, and only with like a singular tool of tariffs, rather than essentially a wholesale reinvestment into the American economy, into infrastructure, into communities which have been blighted and which have been basically abandoned within the current era of neoliberal globalization. And I think Tooze points out that like, even if you wanted to incentivize companies to invest in like let's say like new factory locations within the US, that process itself, it takes years to happen. And like, it's funny because like, actually this is part of the job that I do in my regular life, my daily life, is like, basically like there's this whole network and almost a kind of cabal of like this like industry, which is purely based off of how corporations make location decisions of where they want to invest and where they want to set up location. And it's like basically controlled by this really tight network of people who like are the ones who are advising companies, like, oh, you should set up operations here and not here. But it's like there's all these factors that go into like why companies choose to set up locations anywhere in the world. And part of, I think, what is true is that most companies at this point, at least in this stage, are probably going to avoid making any long-term decisions because of all the uncertainties surrounding the tariff stuff, like Trump himself and people like betting, oh, maybe if Trump, let's say if the Republicans lose in the next election, will things basically reverse under a Democratic administration, all that stuff. And I think this is part of where I'm trying to figure stuff out, because I think on the one hand, Trump has a long-term aspiration of what he wants the United States, but also I think he's still simultaneously trapped within his short-term actions, because this is where I think also Trump gets trapped in his own kind of flood the zone strategy of like, we're going to hit the media, we're going to hit the system with all of this stuff simultaneously all at the same time. With like, we're going to have the Ukraine stuff, we're going to have the Israel, Iran stuff, we're going to have this whole tariff thing which comes out of nowhere. But ultimately, at the end of the day, like, does Trump become a victim of his own kind of like sporadic, I'm going to try to do everything all at the same time approach to governance? And this is where I think this is like, yeah, where I have open questions. But I think the contrast is with something like the Chinese system, in which you have a leadership which has continuity basically throughout the entirety of throughout history and throughout decades, in which like the Chinese leadership is planning not just in 5-year spans, planning in terms of decades. And I think that again, like it would need essentially a broader, comprehensive, and creative strategy to reindustrialize the United States. And I agree with Shantanu on terms that are set by the American people. And in essence, what you would need is a completely different government or a different state and a different governance system, but also a new social contract within the United States in order to achieve the kind of reindustrialization that even Trump says that he's after. And I think the other kind of part of this is that ultimately my interpretation of this is that Trump's vision of reindustrialization is almost like a zero-sum game, where it's like America can only win if China loses. And this is, on the one hand, a flat rejection of the era of neoliberal globalization, but it's also unable to go beyond it. Like, it's unable to articulate a vision which can go beyond that era which we've been stuck in for the past 70 years. And instead, almost it looks like a retreat backwards oftentimes, or it uses the language of which is like almost drawing from a romanticized idea of America's past. And yeah, the last thing is just that I agree that this question of war and the economy are very closely interlinked, because ultimately, we've said this before, but the US, especially for the past 70 years, has used its global reserve currency status to sell its debt and ultimately finance all of these wars around the world. In which it's like, yeah, like the war on terror costs like probably multiple trillions of dollars. All of these wars around the world are costing trillions of dollars to the United States. And the only reason why the US can finance that is because it has this kind of debt system, which can basically expand and expand and expand. And I think, yeah, this is like the big question which is staring Trump in the face, and which is he's trying to figure out a way to approach, but like obviously there's a lot of contradictions in how Trump is approaching it. And I think that, like, yeah, my conclusion is that Twos is probably right, that the main focus of the Trump administration in terms of trade is probably going to be China moving forward, but that the US doesn't have the advantages that Trump thinks it has, or that the US ruling elite thinks it has. And ultimately, that Trump's primary mode and his primary vision is much more destructive than it is reconstructive. And I think that this is part of both the positive aspect of Trump, which is like his ability to basically make people's brain, like people in the media, to make their brains explode, but also like, if you can only offer destruction, like, is that ultimately going to impact and hurt the American people more in the long term too? Or can there be an articulation of a vision which has both long term, but is also part of the reconstruction of American society? But that's kind of what I've been drawing from the whole like Tubes thing.
I did want to say just one other thing, which is I feel like Trump's doubling down on the US dollar, having, saying that we really do need to keep it as a reserve currency. He's in the past, he sort of also said that, if BRICS tries to trade in a different currency, right, we will sanction them and everything. I do think that and this is just my thought, but I do think that that has a lot to do with the current government debt, which is really high. And if the world were to decouple from the dollar, and countries, mostly China, like China is the major country that is holding most of the US debt. If they start calling in those debts, then the US will collapse like completely, just instantly almost. And it also is in direct contradiction to Trump's other plan, which Jeremiah said, which is, you have to sort of contain China if the US is supposed to gain some sort of economic and political superiority on the world scale. So I do think that that has some thing to do with why he wants to double down on it, because there are a lot of people who try to defend these tariffs by saying that, well, these tariffs, what they'll do is, of course, try to bring in manufacturing back into the country, but it's also going to be a way of the government trying to erase its debt. I don't know how feasible that is. I do not understand the economics of all of this. If that is feasible, possible, realistic. But I do think it's on Trump's mind that the government has a huge, huge government debt. I think by 2030, the interest is supposed to be more than the entire country's military budget, almost reaching its own GDP, which is unprecedented and unimaginable. That would actually cause a complete collapse of the US system. And the other thing that I wanted to say was about the nuclear talks that are currently happening between Iran and the US. And I think yesterday night, I think I saw that when these talks were happening, Iran proposed that the entire Middle East would denuclearize, but with Israel. Israel would also have to denuclearize if the entire Middle East, including Iran, has to denuclearize. And it's going to be interesting to see what Trump does with this, because I think that he is surrounded by a lot of yes men at this point. He is not getting a lot of people who, and this is also actually Ross Douthat's point, that he's not getting a moderate inspection of the entire situation. He's not getting people who say that, wait, hold on, hang on, let's think about this. Because I think they're feeding into his Bonapartist method of running the state, and that eventually might not work out in his favor. The American people chose him, I think, to a large extent because he ran on a peace platform. He ran on no war, peace, denuclearization, and I think I was extremely pleased when I heard that the US and China were in the midst of denuclearization talks. That would be huge. That is what Martin Luther King talked about back in the 60s, that is supposed to be our end goal, that is supposed to be our long goal. And if that happens, it would be great. But yeah, I just want to put on the table that this nuclear brinksmanship and what the US brings to the table in terms of this is hugely significant going forward.
The listening to the whole history that you described from the Cold War period and this post-Cold War consensus, and the neoliberal consensus, to put it more concretely. It just struck me. I mean, we've talked about this before, but it struck me once again how flimsy the basis of the supremacy is. When you think about it, like I think even at the science conference, and we've brought this up many times after this, I think Raju had said this thing that the two pillars of American hegemony are not even, like, you wouldn't even put the military there. It would be the dollar and then the university. And now, like, a lot of this conversation that we had about the dollar, if you think about it, and you ask where it derives its authority from, it becomes self-referential, self-defined. You have to believe that it's powerful because the American ruling elite says it's powerful. Nobody really understands the financialized, economy, what's happening, what are stocks, what's crypto. I mean, maybe other people understand more than me, but all I'm trying to say is this: if you really try and investigate the substance of what makes America so indispensable to the rules-based international order and regional peace in West Asia and wherever, like whatever. It's just very hard to come up with concrete, substantive reasons. And because it is that insubstantive, what happens when that authority starts crumbling? I mean, it's just a matter of people not believing in it anymore. And I really liked what Jeremiah brought up, this Chinese reporter, I guess, who was in this interview, who was like, clearly, I mean, she does not represent.
Yeah, she's probably part of the Chinese diaspora.
Yeah, so she probably doesn't represent how Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party the Communist Party of China is going to think about it. Because if you if you give somebody like that, you could like the counter to that would be somebody like Victor Gao, who was on that Alex Krainer. Honestly, I watched that clip so many times because it was just so satisfying. So there's this guy who's an academic and a geopolitical expert, and in an interview, he's being asked, he's Chinese, he's being asked by the interviewer that, oh, you're going to lose 50, US is 15% of your export market, so you're going to get hit real bad. And he straight up says, we don't care. We have been around for 5,000 years. And the US was not around for a majority of that. We will keep going on another 5,000 years. We'll figure out other ways to, we'll strengthen our. I mean, just like you put that man and then you put this, Chinese reporter expert person, and you can see what a sham this is and how fabricated this is. And the reason why I also really appreciated the way Victor Gao is speaking is it is really that simple matter of saying we do not believe in this authority anymore. We do not believe you are indispensable. And it's just like today's conversation really struck me on how flimsy the ground is on which this neoliberal order has been standing for so long. And I think there was one other thing that I'm thinking about. Obviously, I think the broad sense I have of what Trump is trying to do is to attack it, is to change it, but he's not doing it in the most, I don't know, sensible ways because of the reasons that everybody's brought up and so on. But I also the other thing that I had been thinking about a lot is what I mean, maybe this is a very premature question to ask, but I just wanted to put it on the table of what it means for 4 years of Trump presidency to undo something which was flimsy but has managed to survive for 56, I don't know, 60 years at this point, 80 years at this point. What does 4 years? And I think I get cynical about this sometimes because obviously when Kamala Harris was defeated, I saw that as a triumphant moment for the American people because it creates the possibility for the people to take power, for something new to happen in this country, which can, correct some of these long-standing, long-running ways of thinking about the world and America's place in it. But then I've always also had at the back of my mind, what will 4 years do? And even if there are certain changes, changes in its relationship to Russia, and I think this thing of tariff versus sanction is also something that a lot of people have been talking about. But I mean, this might be a little far-fetched, but in this idea that I think I got mainly from that Dialogue Works interview with Alex Krainer, where he says that if you look at it, a lot of what Trump is doing is also attacking Europe. Like when you look at the stuff with NATO and Ukraine, when you look at this Red Sea, disruption of that Red Sea trade route, which is mostly European trade, and then he was also talking about some currency manipulation in Europe right now, and so on and so forth. I also feel like it gave me a sense of, I don't know whether it's an intended or unintended consequence of what Trump is trying to do. But I think there's also this question of can the allies of this neoliberal American consensus be weakened to such an extent that even if Trump is not around, like, he won't be around unless he changes the constitution. But, after 4 years, it will be difficult for this consensus to build back. And I think the Israel question is also, the West Asia Israel question is also related to it, because what you were saying about this denuclearization of Iran only happening, the proposal being that the denuclearization of Iran and the rest of West Asia being contingent on denuclearization of Israel. If this something goes forward, I mean, I'm just trying to say that maybe more than I realized before, certain of these moves are also to not are looking at the long game of weakening the levers of or the allies of this long-standing neoliberal consensus of which America has been at the head. But
I appreciate Dr. Lee. Dr. I was gonna address you.
1 minute, could you just hold on for a second? Put it on hold.
But someone else say something because
Yeah,
I
I
think
can
it's
go. I mean, I was going to say that, the introduction was very clarifying because, like, it showed the complex. I think, the talk introduction is also what you guys were saying really made me think of the complexity of this time and also the role of, like, what we are trying to do here, because we're trying to understand, we're trying to understand these questions also in terms of, like, what does it mean for people, and we are uh, to really go to these questions of the tariffs and the whole financial economy and so on, which I understand very little of. But I think these are questions which have direct the consequences for people, and I think people are also hungry for actually fighting for the clarity of ideas. And to sort of go over the introduction that Doc laid out, and then what you guys were saying about the recent interviews, it shows that I think what it showed me something about what we are trying to do to make these ideas clear and concrete, because none of these people are actually talking about none of them are actually talking about what it means for the people, like the way we're trying to figure out. I think even when we talk about the people, it's some abstract category that they want to use. Even with like the Oren Katz and Dow that interview, I was thinking like they do talk about manufacturing and reindustrialization and so on, but then the question keeps going back. Oh, what's the difference between manufacturing or manufacturing jobs and so on? But it reveals a certain kind of it reveals a certain kind of like completely like removed from the question of who are you talking about, what does it mean, because it's like I think it shows that once you go into this abstract, you immediately can like you go into the dogmatic, and you cannot move with the times. You cannot see people how people are moving. I mean it's no guarantee that manufacturing, the way we talk about it now, the way like what it meant for the American people 30 years back, it's not going to it doesn't there's no rule saying it's going to mean the same thing tomorrow 30 years down the line. And I was saying that I think this going back to like this history, and also to look at it from the question of like not just the monetary and the financial systems, but what does it mean for the poor. I think this is something very important. And what Jeremiah was saying, I was also reminded of the verse a lot because of what we've been reading. Some of us have been reading in recent times, because like when we talk about the monetary system and tariffs and so on, I think the focus is, I mean, even the even the argument that you see on all these podcasts and all of that, even these arguments are, I think sometimes I feel that they're sometimes too theoretical, when like you don't get to the question of like I'm trying to say something that like I think they don't get to the question of in what way do people move, and in what way have the American people shaped, like really have shaped has shaped consciousness, not just here but also in the world. So this is a question, like I think you say it in this, like you say it as the American people as a geostrategic force, and I don't think that this is something that people usually think about in terms of, it's always in terms of the system. But I was reminded of Du Bois because he like the way we have been talking about him as an originary thinker for modernity. I think the question for modernity is to center these questions on the poor. And the question of what the other thing that you had said about when you were talking about US China rapprochement and where the relationship is now, to talk about Deng Xiaoping and to talk about socialism and how he connects it to poverty. This is like, to miss it is to miss everything, and I think you will miss it without seeing Du Bois, because it's his science which centers the question of democracy on poverty. What is the relationship of democracy to poverty? And to not see that is, I think, to go to think of democracy as sort of an abstraction about consensus, majority rule, for what, to what end. And I think this is, maybe this is a time when these questions are becoming, I think they are getting more, like, maybe more reflected in, like, in America and also the rest of the world, where people don't, like, most people in the world don't think about democracy in such narrow dogmatic category. Because I was listening to that thing that you have been, like, sharing with this Chinese scholar, what's Wang Gangwu, and like, even how he talks about the question of modernity. This is not something, I don't think he's saying that there are answers that have been reached, but to ask the question that the question of modernity is centered on how human beings are supposed to feel, are supposed to think about the purpose of their lives. And then the question of poverty is simply a way, like, poverty alleviation is a way to get there. And I feel like this is part of, like, I'm saying this because this shows, I think it showed something about why you have been talking about Du Bois as an ordinary thinker, because it's not to say that to read Du Bois, like, you have to read, like to get to this point is to just read Du Bois's books, but really to say that Du Bois shows something about how the future, and, like, by which I mean today, is going to be shaped. How people throughout the world are going to respond to this question of democracy, like, centering democracy on poverty. And yeah, I wanted to say that because, like, I was reminded by what you were saying, Jeremiah, about like, this whole conversation bringing us back to how like, you didn't say this, but like, to like bringing us back to how we've been talking about question of modernity and Du Bois, because what we are trying to also do, I think, is when we say that Trump, or the election of Trump, has been a rupture to increase the democratic capacity of people, I think it also means that it is through the ideas of Du Bois, it is through these ideas that we can make sense of this, obviously very complex science. And and like, this other thing which I think you also mentioned about, to understand Trump, the long game of Trump, in terms of his attempt to negotiate new economic and political relationships with an emerging world, whether or not, however much conflictions there are, but to think about it in that, I think, in those terms, I think these are terms that are, set by, like, these are terms that are, I think, in many ways invented by Du Bois. And I think this makes the question of, where do the American people see Trump, and how can we as a people move forward, like, either because of, or in spite of Trump, because Trump is he is a manifestation of this capacity of people. That's why he had been elected. But I wanted to say that, like, it reminded me of Du Bois's question of, like to look at the question of modernity in terms of where you centered the poor and the working poor. I want, Go ahead.
No, I think I wanted to start by saying that I really appreciated your introduction, but also what Shantanu and Jeremiah had added as well, because it's a very complex time, and it feels like every day there's so many different facts, but you don't get closer to what is actually going on, and making sense of everything. And I think that also points to actually how important our conversations around like what is knowledge and what is thought, and ways of knowing the world. Because I think some might think that it's just a collection of facts. And it's also something that Du Bois has spoken to as well. This conversation also reminded, I think Shimbarto and Jeremiah were also speaking about it, of our discussions in Bandung of Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, because in this conversation, it reminded me of the chapter that we had read a couple of weeks ago, which was of the Dawn of Freedom, when Du Bois talks about the aftermath of the Civil War and the period of the Freedmen's Bureau. And Du Bois asked this, or Du Bois points this thing that you were speaking to, which is that oftentimes in history, or you look to history, you think of the conquered and the conquered. But in the Civil War and Reconstruction, there was the Negro, which is what were they thinking and what were the possibilities because of the Negro. And that formulation also made me think of something that we have spoken to in free school, which is in our times, what are the possibilities? I think the three that you had mentioned were the ruin of all classes, civil war, or revolution. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think in these discussions, you are also speaking to it, which is, there's the ruling elite and there's Trump and there's all these, and they're going at each other. But what are the people thinking? And because when you think of the people, or when you think of the ruling elite, when you think of Trump, when you think of like the destruction that can come out of all of this, or the chaos that's already been kind of going on, it also shows the limitations of someone like Trump, and it shows the limitations of this framework of viewing this current situation through the lens of the ruling elite and of Trump, because you don't really see a path forward. I think is what you were saying too, which is what is Trump going to do? Like, what is the future for America? Do you go forward by going back? But then by looking at the Negro of the Civil War, or looking at the people of this time, different possibilities can open up. And because I was thinking, like, yeah, what is it that Trump can do that can offer a way forward? And I don't know. Where was I going with this? Oh yeah, this question of new possibilities, which is who is thinking about the long game? Is Trump thinking about the long game, or is he distracted on the way? And yeah, and so this question of where does the long game come from? And but yeah, I'm just appreciative of the brighter minds of free school laying out what's going on, because I was pretty confused this past week. I was like, how do you make sense of all of this? Like, do you like Trump? Do you not like Trump? What is his forethought and his afterthought? It's like, what was going on? And the other thing actually is, what's been interesting is this thing that you had said, where there's the economics, the situation, but underpinning the economics is also the human component to it as well. Because this language of the domestic market, of foreign investment, like that, those all sound like pretty big terms, but actually underpinning it, I realized, is what you were saying, which is that the domestic market means that Chinese people need to spend money. But if they're not, if their values are that they only spend what they have, then it's very hard or I don't know, it's very hard. But like, how do you create a domestic market? And it actually makes sense in the day-to-day lives, I think, of like the Chinese at free school, which is we're American, but at the same time, we have some of these values from our Chinese parents, which is that like they never, this thing of credit cards and spending on credit is not a thing among Chinese people. Or like even within Chinese immigrants, if they're buying a house, they might get a mortgage, but they already have the rest of the money planned out, meaning they have that in their banks, like so that they're not defaulting on their homes when someone loses their jobs. And so I think this conversation actually helped me to make sense of it because, like, what is the domestic market and what is something that, or how is it that the Chinese economic system is going to look different from America's, whether in the past or present? Because it is true, like my family in China, like they don't spend on credit, and then also here, and then this other thing, which is that this, because I think China is also complex in that there is this like looking to the West as well among particularly the youth. Like at some point, definitely a decade ago, it was a status symbol to own an iPhone or to own a BMW, or even among like, working people. But over the past several years, there has been this shift, or I don't know if it's, I don't know where exactly the shift is coming from, but this nationalism and patriotism of buying Chinese goods, whether it's like cars or phones, and I only say those examples because those examples are what helps me to make sense of these larger economic trends or forces when we talk about like China being the factory of the world. Exporting goods to now creating an indoor domestic market in which they're both creating and consuming as well.
Yeah, sometimes. No, it's okay. Oh yeah, I was gonna say sometimes I feel like we think such similar things because, like last weekend, my sister visited me, and sometimes I'm always like, my sister, she's not political, but actually, we have like really interesting conversations. We literally just talked about debt. Because she was like telling me about some of her gripes with like her in-laws, and she was just like, one of the things she mentioned was she was like, I didn't realize that she's talking about white Americans, but I think you could say it for most Americans. She's like, I didn't realize that it was that most Americans are in debt because there's the whole point of the credit system is like it's very strange coming from even a very westernized Chinese American family because my family does not believe in debt. No, we don't believe in credit. We don't believe in debt. Like you pay your credit card bill. Like I was taught to pay my credit card bill every day, like literally every day. Not even when the statement comes. Like they're like, you should not spend what you don't have. And my sister was basically like, but anyways, that was just one example. But like I agree with what you were also saying about that the conversation was very helpful in terms of the economics because actually what was really clarifying. I guess the two things that are clarifying. One is, I think this whole week I felt the same way. I was like, are these tariffs good or bad? Like, should I like them, dislike them? Like, for who? For me? For the workers? For like, I was trying to weigh it out on scales of like, okay, it might be good for these people. But then at the end of the day, in some ways, the only way to even understand not just the tariffs, but even Trump and what's happening in the country is to actually put it in the long history. I guess it's short history, because actually that was something that I think both you laid it out, and I think in some ways, I guess this is my second point, but you laid it out, and then also I also was looking into the Wong Gung Wu guy, who I think is Australian or Malaysian, I forget, but he's a Chinese diaspora.
Singaporean.
Or Singaporean?
I think Singaporean.
He could be any of them. It's all the same. They're all 4 tigers. So, but he also had, in some ways, he actually had a similar but also slightly different timeline, which I actually think is important or interesting, which is what you clarified, Doc, is that the what Trump is facing or like wanting to undo is a set of military, economic, and political arrangements that have its origins after World War II. But like the other timeline that this Chinese intellectual added was, he was like, if we want to talk about the world order, he was like, actually the unipolar world order that we see today is a very new, like he was like, I would only give it a lifetime of up to 30 years. Because I think he's referring to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he was basically making the point that he's like, a country like China has never really assumed that there is such thing as a unipolar world order until very recently. And so even Trump, even like, and he made the point that he was like, the issue is that Americans have a very short memory span where they misread history because they assume, like, it kind of goes into the paranoia of Trump, right? Where he's like, oh, if we're in this position, it must be because so many other people, both outside and inside the country, are against like America, best interests. When really this Chinese intellectual is making the point of there's a much longer history of like America being hegemonic is actually a very recent consolidation. And in some ways you could say that sure, the cost of empire began a lot earlier with the Korean War after World War II, but the cost of empire accelerated after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And yeah, so that really clarified things because like for me, I'm always asking just in simple terms, I'm like, wait, so what is Trump upset about? And like I think like I just ask myself like that. I'm just okay, what is Trump upset about? What is he up in arms about? And I feel like in some ways what we were talking about in Free School, or what we clarified, is that like what Trump is actually responding to in the way he responds is what you said, Doc, which is he's upset about or up in arms about the fact that an old system, which is an expired force and no longer fits what is becoming a new nation, which already is a new or will become a new nation. I think you said it like that.
Yeah, I said a new world, but yes.
Oh yeah, new world.
Yeah, new.
And yeah, and I think I agree that actually it's important. It is clarifying to see the short game and the long game, because actually the short game we would be down with, right? Like, oh, the rapid undoing of American empire, which will have like both good and also like very harmful consequences. Like, but at the same time, the long game, which is the more open question, would be Trump. Basically, the long game of Trump is negotiating with new nations for a new world. But the question is, one, I feel like you were raising the Shimbardo. One, why must the new world hinge upon the negotiation of nations? And then two, where do the people fit into the equation? Because in some ways what Oren, Cass, and Twos are raising actually you guys really raised this up and then you added onto it, which clarified something to me, is the question of reindustrialization. Where Twos says, okay, I think reindustrialization is not only is it not this vision, not real, but it's not feasible. Whereas Oren Cass, I actually think the conversation about manufacturing jobs is not just theoretical. It's actually a very concrete, important question for the country, like concretely for the country. But in some ways, what you probably are dissatisfied with is that, and like what I'm dissatisfied with is, it's not really a question of do we need manufacturing or not. The real question is are we going to achieve a democratic economy or not, right? Like, because even because a democratic economy would be, are the workers themselves, are the working class of people who make up the large masses of people in this country, are they in the equation in terms of democratically demanding a certain type of economy plus a certain type of society? And I think, and then related to a democratic economy would be one, legitimacy. It was interesting when you were talking about China, because like Deng Xiaoping, I mean, in a lot of ways, you have to put a lot of respect on his name, because he's the reason why is during that period of China's history that actually legitimizes the Communist Party of China and the stability of the state to provide actual real material gains for the people. That is required for any nation, any state, including America at this point, where whoever runs America there will have to be a period of actually gaining a legitimacy again. That's why, like, Jeremiah, you bring up social contracts so much. You have to regain a certain legitimacy that comes from the masses of people must see some sort of material gains because the American way of life is not providing anymore, because neoliberalism is falling apart, because neoliberalism from the very beginning was a deal that America made with China. So it's not a like, oh, the whole world is colluding against us. It's your deal. Your deal was bad. Your deal was bad, and everyone else played the game. And now, like, you know, you're seeing the results of that. But yeah, legitimacy of like, so like a democratic economy would both require a certain level, like it would legitimize. It would, you know, the state itself would have to be legitimate enough to be legitimizing, like, you know, gains, but also it would be a peace economy.
Yeah.
And I feel like the question of manufacturing jobs is not just about manufacturing. It's about it's a certain level of it basically has to be connected to peace. Like that is the main issue. The issue is not we need more factories in certain locations. The issue is basically the relationship between like the economy, like how democratic it is, how much it serves the people, how much the people democratically demand it, and then hence its relationship to like basically peace. Okay, I know that's kind of a weird way of saying it, but the reason why I think it's important is because yeah, like kind of like what Alice was saying with China, bringing in the reason why it's so important to bring in the conversation of China is because actually like because actually China the reason why Xi Jinping is so important and has become as equivalent in stature and importance to Chinese history and the Chinese people as Deng Xiaoping and Mao is because Xi Jinping, not only did he like, you know, uproot corruption, all that stuff, but the reason why he's significant is because he actually represents something very different than Deng Xiaoping and Mao. Because Mao, like I got this from that guy, the Chinese intellectual, like Wang Gongwu, but he was basically like, China, what is different with Xi Jinping is that he does not believe in a new world order like the same way Mao did. Mao's whole idea was, okay, we're going to create a new world order where just like in this millennia of history, China is the middle kingdom and will be the center of civilization. Instead, Xi Jinping almost has this, I feel like Xi Jinping has a certain, like the way the Communist Party of China right now is acting is, I think they're very aware that they're like, no matter how, to what degree we decouple our economy, like Alice was pointing out, we will never be able to be a standalone economy. Like we will never, ever, ever. There's no such thing as complete decoupling. And it's also why, like, it's pretty amazing what even North Korea has been able to do because they've gone to a certain degree, much longer way of juche, like decoupling, very self-sustaining economy. But China will never be able to decouple completely, even though they have made a lot of gains in decoupling in order to like in order to predict volatile changes of basically what we would call white modernity, like white modernity failing upon itself. But there will have to be a point of recoupling, which is also why it's funny that Trump, I think to a certain degree, Oren Cass has this idea of like, we're going to also decouple. I think he says it. He's like, we have to decouple. But the thing is like, I think Xi Jinping has asserted in the Communist Party of China, the reason why they're so emphatic of this whole thing of shared community of world something. They're always saying shared community, is because unlike Mao, I think the Communist Party of China has entered this new stage of thought where they know that the only way out is peace. Like that is the only future for humanity. Literally the only future for humanity, their economy, the Chinese people is there's no such thing as isolating. There's no such thing as decoupling. The only way out economically, like out of just even economically is for peace, which is why I think Xi Jinping is very much like, is always giving speeches about like shared world, shared whatever, shared neighbors, shared community, shared whatever. And I think that is and I think that's that with that in mind, plus what you ended with, Doc, about like that there is in America a peace consensus developing. And it's whether you want to say it's embryonic, it's a little uncertain, there's definitely movement towards a peace consensus in different ways. And especially even just with the tariffs, the idea that the reason why Trump wants to undo like what he sees as kind of like a very bad, like neoliberal, whatever he calls it, really bad neoliberal arrangement that has put us in the dump, is because he knows empire is too expensive.
Yeah.
And so even if he's not like, oh yeah, I'm like, even if he, whether it's an intended or unintended consequence, he is creating an environment and making moves towards a certain peace consensus that the only way out for America would be peace. The question is how much he will be able to get there or not, especially with factors like you listed, Israel, Yemen, like a certain level of white supremacy, all of that. So yeah, that's why it was helpful for me, because I was like, I don't know. At a certain point, I kind of went into video game mode where I was like, this might as well just be a video game where we're trading monopoly money, because like I'm like, what are tariffs? What are they gonna do? Like, I mean, the eggs are already expensive. Are they gonna get more expensive? Like, I was like, I don't know how. Money's just so abstract to me. Like, the economy is just so abstract to me.
Yeah.
Oh, just one quick thing to add. Actually, something made more sense as you were speaking, which is that in some ways, Trump does have to fold or give in, because if there's any part of him that is anti-war or realizes that empire is too expensive, and he might not have the same language of a peace industrial economy, but if it's going to be any sort of new economy for the US that is not based on war, then it can only really look to China as an example. Meaning, oh shit, like we need to turn things around in this country, build something new. And the example to look to is China, where it's able to have been able to develop a modern economy that hasn't been connected to war. And so, I don't know if he recognizes that. So.
One of the, oftentimes, one of the sources of continuity and consensus among the US elite is they can only justify reindustrialization because of war. Because they're like, oh, we need to have domestic industry, because what if we did go to war with China? Then it would be really bad if, like, for instance, semiconductors were all concentrated in China. So we need to have that. Like, that was the one source of continuity even between Biden and Trump, which is Biden was only really interested in reindustrialization in the interest of war, which is like, we need to have both defense manufacturing here, but also critical industries which might be threatened in a wartime situation. But it's like, that's also short-sighted thinking, because aside from even being amoral or immoral, it's that even if you want to bring those industries in for the purpose of protecting them in the case of war, it's like, okay, like if you're serious about the prospect of nuclear war with China, like there wouldn't even be like an actual industry. Like basically, yeah, like if you actually like if there was nuclear war, then it's like you're even, especially on the defense side, you're only producing industry for things that can only be used for destructive purposes rather than for productive purposes. But I feel like this is where like this is where like Trump himself would actually at some point have to make an actual decision, like where King says like now is the time for real choices and not false ones. And it's like, yeah, like are you only going to really be interested in reindustrialization because you're afraid of the prospect of war with China? Or are you interested in reindustrialization because you actually have some vision for the American people, which is completely tied in with this question of war? And I think the other question which is raised, sorry, I know we're going on, but like the other question which is raised by what we're talking about is, does Trump see himself as the man of destiny? Because I think this is part of what feeds him, like feeds his own sense of ego, which is like he derives a lot of his own sense of purpose from being like, oh, I'm the one who's driving world history forward. When actually it's the American people and the people of the world who are driving history forward. And Trump is only, in essence, a small player within that drama. But he doesn't recognize that because he thinks that, like, oh, I'm the one. Like, I am the great man of history. I am the man of destiny. And, like, therefore, like, that's where he both is, like, that's what enables him to have a sense of, like, I don't know, boldness and whatever. But it also, that's, like, his greatest, like, pitfall is, like, he thinks that he's the one who's controlling the flow of world events and world history. Sorry.
No. I think it's well, actually, let me I also just wanted to say I'm really grateful for this conversation. It has been a very whirlwind week, and also we didn't have free school last week, didn't we? Because we were out in Chicago.
yeah.
We were all out in Chicago for the event. So I think it has been feeling like a very unmoored 2 weeks for me personally, without having had this conversation or like this space to talk about this. And also, I also just want to say I appreciate basically laying out this chronology essentially that goes back to the end of World War II rather than, beginning any kind of like discussion of making sense of this time through the lens of like 2016, for example. That's just too short to make sense of what has been the development, the rise of this, this hegemonic structure that we're now experiencing or witnessing in real time. It's free fall. But something that you were saying, and then also from, I think, Jeremiah, you're also mentioning when you brought up the idea of like the short, the middle, but the long ranges of calculuses. I was also reminded of the King quote of like the colony of time and the empire of eternity. Like that always felt like, oh, it's so obvious. Like, of course, I'd rather choose the empire of eternity or something. But in when it comes to these kind of moments where it is so complex and so confusing, like that actually is a really important moral criteria to be able to really say like there is such a thing as a people's calculus of like their long-term vision, and that vision is peace, like, and whatever doesn't like fit that or goes against it must be identified. And I think that's why we are so harsh on the left, and we are so we are still like we're always constantly like judging, I think, Trump and all of these different political like developments through that lens. And so, and also identifying where the people like are also like actively shaping, like aware of that very like agenda, that vision, and are shaping the course of things. Like I think also what I'm realizing is that it's also bringing back the memory this week. We started this week at Lucian Blackwell Library, restarting the reading group that was growing out of the Year of Baldwin reading group. And we had started it through screening King in the Wilderness, that documentary, but also it hadn't been our original intent, but the more we talked about it, and it was going off of your suggestion to read the Beyond Vietnam speech, that I think now, like, I'm only even starting to make sense of what we're doing there in a new light, because I think in terms of our conversations around the cost of empire, like King just so beautifully in that speech outlines the spiritual cost of empire. I know, I think that like it is tied to like the economic cost, like, but it is also a spiritual cost that the American people have carried for too long, and maybe even like it's so evident then, but like it should be even more appalling to us today. And so, I mean, I'm just thinking about what that meant to even have a conversation with like people to like it brought out a lot to have a place where the ordinary people were making sense of the relationship to war and peace. And I mean, like I think there was somebody in the reading group that we had met previously and had been coming, we had not known that the speech had moved me so much for him to share. He's a veteran of the Iraq War, and that he still carries with him the psychiatric, scars from that experience. And that was just not something I feel like had come up before. And whether it was the Baldwin reading group in previous conversations, like we really have moved to a new stage with that. And, I mean, I just put that on the table because I just want to continue thinking about this question of like, how do the American people like play their part, or like in this the vast long-term like calculus of what it means to like achieve like a new democracy, a new economy, but also a new world, and rejoining world humanity. Like, what is it that they must do? What is it that they must carry with them? And what is it that there is a lot coming down on the American people right now, I think, making it particularly confusing. But how is it that we can carry forward essentially, and not lose sight essentially of
Yeah, I wanted to say some stuff, but I hadn't fully put it together in my head. But I also wanted to say, or come back to this question of American people, because I guess the question I'm thinking through is, how does all of this transform? Like the American people, I mean, the American people's revolutionary struggle for a new democracy, like in an irreversible way. Because, yeah, like I'm also absorbing a lot from what different people have said, but I think the big thing I'm taking away from like, oh, okay, 3 months of Trump in office is that an irreversible process has been set into motion, which is beyond even what we saw in Trump's first term, where I do not see like I could not see a play out of 2020 happening again, where a certain neoliberal consensus is reestablished in the 2028 election. Like, I actually think it'll be an important question to see, like, what type of leadership might actually emerge for the next major election. And, like, what that irreversible process, I think, basically is like, the people becoming increasingly central to like the democratic reworking out of what like the future of this country is going to be, because like I also kind of had trouble speaking because like your remarks actually made me pretty emotional in terms of thinking like, yeah, like the American people, like this is a crisis. And
The American people.
like, well, I thought back a lot to the free school 10th anniversary vision statement. And I think you had written it off, but the thing that you had written is like, oh, for the majority of the American people, like this is a dark and barren landscape. And like it's kind of painful to like process together that Trump's election like obviously doesn't change that. And it's like what you said, Jeremiah, in terms of like, oh, like you can't undo decades of a neoliberal consensus, or like you can't undo decades of like like a government of empire, like through like 3 weeks of tariffs. Like literally the only answer is a complete restructuring of the way this country is governed, like philosophically, like economically, politically, like educationally, everything, like nothing less than a revolution. And that's why, like, during today's conversation, I kept thinking back to like certain things that were said in the vision statement, where you had also written, like, and this is why we cast our lot with the American people, because, like, we understand that more than ever, the American people are in consensus that they do not want this to be a nation that is predicated on war anymore. Like increasingly, the American people come to see like the central question is the question of peace, like coming to like a consensus of peace, and then like there is that last thing you said, which is like, oh, and that is why like we welcome the future, because what history, like this history of the Black freedom struggle, but also the world, the way the world is developing, shows us is like that there is a way out, but it will not be easy. And like a lot of what I was processing throughout our conversation is basically like our task doesn't change, but the stakes are higher for our work. And this is not like this is the crisis. And like I don't like everything that Trump is doing, I think accelerates that attack or that breakdown or that collapse of the imperial state. But yeah, I don't know how long it will last, and I don't know how much more like immiseration like there will be in the meantime. Because yeah, I also just want to emphasize that thing that like the reindustrialization pre-World War II or like post-World War II is not going to be possible anymore. And like, you know, just what you were saying, Emily, I thought that was important. But yeah, I think the last thing I wanted to say is like, okay, the American people will have to go beyond Trump. I think this is what this shows. And that the American, actually a leader that is reflective of the actual democratic will of the American people, we have not seen yet. And like, and in some ways, I would say that American people have already gone beyond Trump. And that's even, for example, why we're looking at Black music the way we're looking at it is because there's an entire alternate worldview for dealing with the questions or the problems of the 20th century, questions of poverty, like questions of democracy and the human being, that is already more advanced than anything the Trump administration could imagine. And then, like, along with what Emily and Alice was saying, China, like, continuing to look at China and to look at the democratic advancements of China in the last few decades, I think is very important. And then I think the last thing I wanted to say is I think I do wonder what will happen with the next election, because I feel like what this presidential cycle will also prove is like the failure of white leadership, or how, like, I don't know if I can even see another Trump-like figure being elected again, because I think for basically white leadership, like, this is his role, right? like to channel the anger or like the despair of the American people to make like a strategic smash in, like, you know, the neoliberal order of the state. But without Black leadership, like without what you hear in Black music, like love, a concept of the children, the future, education, peace, like, where can this country go? So I think the idea of the American people became more concrete in today's conversation. And I appreciate your remarks. Like, I appreciated your remarks.
I just wanted to add a short thing to what Michelle is saying, because I agree, it is emotional. That reminded me everything that was said today. From the very beginning, I was thinking about King's Revolution of Values a lot, because I think if you think about it, the history of this country is pretty tragic. And I think in some ways you can also say, I don't know if this is an overstatement, but the American people are some of the most disenfranchised people in the whole world.
Absolutely.
And that's ironic, because that's not the image. Like, when I was in India before coming into this country, that's not what I would have imagined. And everything that was said today about China and the social contract, I mean, you can clearly see when we talk about the neoliberal consensus being defeated, it's not just like, I agree with whoever said, it's not like a structural statement. It's also a statement of values and worldview. Because when you compare it with what China, you said, in China, this basic idea that the people won't be poor, they'll have good homes, the children will have a future. What happens when the primary impulse between governance and policy and law and everything is the welfare of a whole people, as opposed to when the impulse is empire, the people always come last. Peace always comes last, because your entire concern is empire and money and profit and whatnot. And I mean, this is also why, like, when I think of China as a country, or you think of any country, its character comes from its people. Like, the image of it comes from its people, its culture, its civilization, its revolutionary history. But because of its, like, enslavement to empire and hegemony, this country hasn't even been able to build its image around its own revolutionary history, around its own culture and art and all of that. And it's
So that's music.
Okay, it's almost 2, so I can read maybe a few comments. Michelle, Mel, Nicola, Gannon, Todd, good morning. Michelle was saying that, the protest last Saturday was demonstrations of the slow resistance. Mumble says the US views propaganda by the tonnage, but on the other hand, China has more of a supervised capitalism or economy. Todd says that the slogan "hands off NATO" is really funny and odd. Robert said during your presentation, Doc, like, he's speaking truth. Yes, even Trump has a limit. Looking for practical system, Trump is a good place to start for that. Some comments on Israel, saying that Israel's totally out of control, a big poisonous snake in the world, and that Trump's stance on Gaza is immoral, and there's absolutely no question. Kamble says, it seems to me that Trump is backing away the stuff that he cannot get away with. He would cause havoc had it not been for the real consequences. There's a conversation about different yayas that people know in their lives. Yeah. And then some jokes about Trump not calling back Ursula von der Leyen. Michelle Bell says, most people have nothing to invest in the stock market. It's as simple as that. And someone named Apollo West says, some on the left are questioning if the US will ever have a revolution due to its elaborate media and education propaganda apparatus. I'm also starting to feel that doubt. Questions about whether China is the focal player or whether it's Russia, whether the ruling class will let anything new emerge, and then, yeah, and doubts that there is even going to be another election. So there's definitely some cynicism in the chat today.
Michelle, I think you could give an update on the music symposium.
Yes. Dot, Kathy, Crystal, Sarah, and I have been organizing the last month for a symposium that we're going to have in mid-May. So it's going to be exactly 4 weeks from this weekend. It's going to be May 10th and May 11th at the Triple Institution. So the purpose of the symposium is, well, it's titled Seizing Our Future, the Revolutionary Music of Ellington, Mingus, Sun Ra, and Bootsy. So Duke Ellington, all of them are composers, Duke Ellington, Charles Mingus, Sun Ra, and then Bootsy Collins, who's funk. And together they cover the chronology from the anti-slavery struggle up until today. I think Bootsy is still alive.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we want to look at what type of, well, there's a couple purposes. One is to recover like the intense political spirit of this music as a struggle, as like a mounted struggle against the white supremacist school system and for the freedom of people, and Black people in particular. And we see that as an imperative task at this time because of how the counter-revolution and the crisis has, to use a phrase from today, decoupled this music from everything that had made it possible, which is a worldview and a moral commitment that could create like this type of sound. And I think along with that, we also want to look at how this music articulates a new world movement of thought and how it deals or engages with the modern questions of the 20th and 21st century that the Western, the white world was never able to answer, let alone potentially even ask. Certain questions about the human being, certain questions about, like, yeah, I mean, what it means to be a complete human being is an important one. So I think we want to celebrate their lives, but we also want to study their lives as serious thinkers, serious artists, and freedom fighters, and to clarify what that level of moral commitment would look like today. I think that the last thing I would say is that we've looked at sociologically, we've looked at this music a lot the past few years in the city, and I think we have seen a lot together as free school, going to all of these different jazz shows, developing political relationships with different artists and different musicians. But it's hard to say that none of them have been able to make a defense of this music the way that free school alone can, and we will. And yeah, I keep saying this, but I think the last thing I want to say is that this is also our first political event dedicated specifically to music as a vanguard of as a vanguard force of the revolutionary struggle of the American people. And something that Serafina had said during our planning that I think was really important is music is the veins of the people, and is the veins of the people. And this music is the veins of the American people. And so long as we have this music, we have a future, but it needs to be recovered, it needs to be defended. And so I think we're still working out the exact times, but tentatively maybe 1 to 6 p.m. on both days. And this event is going to be structured a little differently in that we don't want it to be academic at all. Like no presentations, no discussions. Like let's just listen to the music and let it speak for itself. And like let's frame the music. Like let's put the music where it deserves to be put. And we won't have live performances most likely either. So a lot of the time is just going to be spent watching live videos of these performance, like these composers, the way they thought, like the way they move through the world, the way they play, the way they led. Do you want to add anything?
I don't have too much to add. I mean, it's just been for me, I think just to also echo a lot of what you said, Michelle. It is true that, yeah, we have looked at this music quite a lot for like many years now as free school, but only now as we really see not only the stakes of, even in light of the discussion we're having today, the crisis that we're experiencing, the necessity for the American people to recover a revolutionary spirit that has been robbed of them, and then also even like the fact that so far we've been, frankly, I guess, disappointed in the way that this music has been trivialized and also like not been properly defended and not been properly talked about and articulated. And it's actually just been really humbling for me to realize like this is where we find ourselves, and this is the necessity for us to go forward with this symposium and to be really precise about what we're going to say about these 4 composers and how it is that like in a time of war and peace, like this is a full-throated call for the American people to find themselves and like join the hands together in the name of peace and democracy, and also what we're saying about rejoining world humanity. And like this is the basis through which like this music is also, I mean, I'm just really hung on this thought that this is also like an American music, but also part of world music. And that to me still is something I'm like, just trying to find ways to articulate through this conference and this symposium. But I think that these are 4 very astounding composers, and they produce so much is what we're also discovering. And so I'm really excited for, I don't know, Kristen.
This just something that Michelle has spoken of, and I know she feels, and I agree with this, that to make jazz, what is called jazz, a museum piece, where it's almost as though you're performing something from the distant past that has no significance for now. And we've all been doing a lot of research and reading and listening, and that music is as alive and as relevant now as it was when it was first produced. So this is, and then of course, something that seems to have been lost completely is the struggle for freedom. I mean, and I know I talk about this to Michelle and how exacerbating and angry it is for me sometimes that very simple essence, which all of them talk about, these people that we're mentioning, and you come up till today and you can go to various jazz venues and it's as though that wasn't even a part of what's happening now. And it's inexplicable. I know we have to work out how we do have to answer that. And therefore, so many people walk away from jazz, are not interested in Ellington or Mingus or Sun Ra or those in particular, because they want something relevant to this time. And the way it is played and the way the people who play it behave or talk, they treat it themselves as something that is dead and only appropriate for a museum. Oh, Chris, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I think the only thing I want to add, and it relates to this conversation about like, the long and the short game is like we have been talking about how this music is contextualized within like modernity or like an axial age, and that this is the music of modernity. And like I think there's a lot still that is being worked out about that, and yeah, but like what makes like if this is modern music, like by what criteria are we evaluating that? And like what makes it modern? And it's everything from the way the musicians approach their instruments to the way like an orchestra is constructed to like the striving that is needed in order to play this music at all. And the way that's like seen the most clearly is when you watch the performances and you compare it to like these live performances you see today, like Wynton Marsalis, you've been comparing to Wynton Marsalis or like European orchestras, and the music, like there's a completely different human essence that comes out from the musicians when they're playing and when they're performing in like Sun Ra's orchestra or Duke Ellington or like Charles Mingus's Little Big Band compared to these huge 100-person orchestras that you see. So I think that has been really how this reveals a new human being or complete human being. I think it's awesome.
Oh, you want to say it? Okay. Yeah. Oh, one small thing is yesterday I attended half of their meeting and it was really fun because like I feel one thing that Doc said was that thing of when you listen to it seriously, you realize that this music could never come from a white imaginary. Yeah. Yes. I thought that was kind of deep. Yes.
Well, I wanted to say, I'm very excited for the event, but also like what you were saying about, it not being relevant or it being considered to be something of the past in the museum. Like this is very central to the whole conversation today about, the centrality of war and peace, because I think this is why, like we have been talking about all of these thinkers from a time, especially, King, like going into Lucian Blackwell, that the question of war and peace is something that really like brings our time face to face with like 60, 70 years back. Like how I think you said this in terms of how it connects our generations. But I think like the question of jazz and the role it played during this time, like where the consciousness of war was at the forefront of the American people.
I know, just a small thing. I know Emily, she really loves Charlie Mingus.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And I mean,
I only just discovered it yesterday. So I only just discovered it yesterday. So just like you said, I might change my mind next week.
Yeah. Well, because just our experience, just to share with you, just quickly, our experience in looking at all of this and sharing performative performances, it's just been very exciting. I think Michelle made the leaflet that we're going to distribute.
Whoa. Wow. I did.
I mean,
I'm working on a flyer.
Yeah. Which I think you all will find is very nice.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And of course, part of my impatience with what is called activism in this and other cities is that I think someone said about, the spiritual cost of war. I think that was you,
That's
Kathy.
interesting.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And in the dialectic, the spiritual, the spirit of the people rises in spite of it. And you hear it, it doesn't take rocket science to hear it in Ellington and Mingus and Sun Ra. It's just music uh, and creating a spiritual life world that is indispensable for this country, for the youth of this country. And that is because a lot of things I get by Michelle bouncing her feelings off on me and so on, that she feels that so many current musicians have failed young people and are failing young people and are indifferent to young people and actually believe that this music will not appeal to young people.
Yeah.
And all of it is wrong. But
Well, can I just say one more thing? I think we'll try to bring a flyer next Saturday, which would give us 3 weeks for outreach. But I think this is an event where we're really trying to reach new audiences and old audiences. So returning to a lot of institutions that we already know, like through the musicians we already know, but yeah, I just wanted to say that because I think there'll be all hands on deck for outreach. Like this will appeal to a wide audience. Okay.
Well, I think it's lunchtime.
just one other thing. Oh no, forgive me for this. Meghna Jahan said that Minister Ismail Mohammed's secretary has contacted them, and Minister Ismail is available to do the interview after May 11th.
Nice. Wow.
So this should be big for avant-garde.
Yeah.
Wow.
Avant-garde, issue 4 coming soon. Hopefully.
Okay, bye everyone. See you.